Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's darkest secrets, a story buried beneath crowns and lies, hidden behind the most famous face of the Renaissance. Picture this: Richmond Palace, England, March 21st, 1603. It's past midnight. In a shadowed chamber, a 69-year-old woman refuses to sit, refuses to eat, and most terrifying of all, refuses to sleep. She's been standing for 15 hours straight. Her ladies-in-waiting beg her to rest, spreading cushions across the floor in desperation. But when they plead with her to lie down, she whispers something that would haunt them forever. "If you knew what awaited me in my bed, you would not lie down either." This woman is Queen Elizabeth of England, and tonight we're going to uncover the sickening secret she took to her grave. Now, before we step into Elizabeth's world together, I want to ask you something. If this story grabs you, if you find yourself pulled into the mystery, moved by the tragedy, or shocked by what you're about to learn, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and tap the like. Not because I'm asking, but because you genuinely want more stories like this. And hey, drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Are you in bed in California? On a night shift in Texas? Listening from across the ocean? I'd love to know. Alright, dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle white noise. And let's step back in time. The year is 1603 and a queen is dying. Let me paint you the scene. Richmond Palace sits quiet along the Thames River, its windows dark except for one chamber where candlelight flickers. Inside, the most powerful woman in the world is falling apart. Elizabeth I, Gloriana, Good Queen Bess, the Virgin Queen, stands in the center of her withdrawing room, swaying slightly. Her ladies watch her with growing alarm. She hasn't eaten a proper meal in days. She won't let doctors near her, and she absolutely, positively will not lie down. Now you might think, why? Why would someone dying refuse to rest? Here's what makes this so chilling. Elizabeth knew something her attendants didn't. She knew that the moment she lay down in that bed, it would all be over. Not just her life, but her secret. The thing she'd protected for nearly 70 years. The reason she never married. The truth behind why the most eligible queen in history chose complete, absolute isolation over love. For 44 years she'd ruled England with an iron will. She'd defeated the Spanish Armada. She'd survived assassination plots, religious upheaval, and more marriage proposals than any woman in history. She'd built an empire and a legend. But now, at the end, all those walls were crumbling and she was terrified. Her cousin, Robert Carey, visited her just 2 days earlier. When he entered her chamber, he found her sitting on a pile of cushions on the floor. Not in a chair, not in bed, but on the ground like a child who'd given up on everything. She took his hand. Her grip was weak, her palm cold. "No, Robin," she whispered. "I am not well." And then she sighed. He counted. 40 sighs in just a few minutes. Each one sounded like she was letting go of something heavy, something old. Her ladies told him she'd been like this for 10 days. 10 days of barely eating, refusing help, standing until her legs couldn't hold her anymore. The physicians were beside themselves. This was the Queen of England dying before their eyes, and she wouldn't let them examine her. Why? What was she hiding? One anonymous observer at the time wrote something fascinating. She could be prevailed on neither by entreaties, arguments, nor artifices, to take the least medicine and scarcely sufficient nourishment to support life. She could get no sleep whatever. Think about that for a moment. This isn't just an old woman being stubborn. This is strategic, calculated. Elizabeth had spent her entire life controlling her image, controlling what people knew about her, controlling the narrative. And now, facing death, she was making one final power move. You will know nothing. You will see nothing. My body is my secret. even in death. Her attendants became so desperate they spread cushions all over the floor, hoping she might collapse onto something soft rather than hurt herself. And eventually she did collapse. But even then, even lying on the floor unable to stand anymore, she wouldn't move to the bed, because she knew, once you go to that bed when you're this sick, you're admitting defeat. You're giving death permission. Robert Cecil, her chief advisor and the son of her longtime counsellor William Berkeley, finally tried to command her. "Your Majesty," he said firmly, "you must go to bed. Big mistake." Elizabeth's eyes snapped to his face. Even weak, even dying, the royal fire still burned. "Must," she said, her voice sharp as a blade. "Must is not a word to use to princes, little man. Little man," she paused, letting that sink in. "You know I must die, and that makes you so presumptuous." Imagine being Robert Cecil in that moment. You're trying to save the Queen's life, and she's reminding you, even now, even at the end, that she's still the one with power. Not you. Never you. This was Elizabeth's superpower, and she wielded it until she literally couldn't stand anymore. But here's where it gets really interesting. Why was she so afraid? What was waiting in that bed? According to the whispers that spread through court, according to the reports that foreign ambassadors sent back to their kings, Elizabeth was haunted. They said she was tormented by ghosts. Mary Queen of Scots, her cousin, whom she'd ordered beheaded, the Earl of Essex, her young favourite, whom she'd sent to his execution, her mother, Anne Boleyn, who'd lost her head when Elizabeth was just a toddler. But I think it was something deeper, something more primal than guilt. Elizabeth was afraid of vulnerability. Her entire life had taught her one brutal lesson. The moment you show weakness, the moment you let someone see the real you, they'll use it to destroy you. And in that bed, sick, dying, unable to control her body anymore, she would be completely terrifyingly vulnerable. She'd spent 70 years building the image of the Virgin Queen, the goddess-like ruler who needed no man, who sacrificed personal happiness for England's good, who was married only to her kingdom. But what if that wasn't the whole truth? What if there was a reason, a physical reason, why she could never marry? What if her body held a secret so scandalous, so impossible to explain in the 1500s that she'd rather die standing up than risk anyone discovering it? Here's something most people don't know. After Elizabeth died, on March 24th, 1603, in the early hours of the morning, her Lady of the Bedchamber did something unusual. She refused to allow a post-mortem examination. Flat out refused. The official reason? To protect the Queen's reputation as a virgin, to preserve the myth. But historians have wondered for 400 years, what would that examination have revealed? Because here's the thing, Elizabeth's contemporaries, the people who lived with her, who served her, who proposed marriage to her, many of them believed she had some kind of physical condition. The Spanish ambassador wrote that she had a malady in one of her breasts. Others whispered she was barren, that she had some congenital defect that made marriage impossible. In 1561, she was mysteriously bedridden with an illness that caused her body to swell. What was that about? Nobody knows. The records are frustratingly vague. Modern historians and medical experts have proposed some theories that would have been unthinkable, literally unspeakable in Elizabeth's time. Could she have had what we now call complete androgen insensitivity syndrome? A hormonal condition that would have made her appear female but unable to have children? Or perhaps vaginal agenesis? Or any number of other conditions that, in the Tudor period, would have been seen as shameful, cursed, or proof she wasn't truly a woman at all. We may never know for certain, but what we do know is this. Elizabeth spent her final days standing upright, refusing to surrender, clinging to Robert Dudley's last letter, the man she'd loved her whole life but could never marry. She stood there in the candlelight, swaying, sighing, remembering everything. All the choices, all the sacrifices, all the loneliness. And when they finally convinced her to go to bed on March 21st, when they finally got her to lie down, she never got up again. She died 3 days later on March 24th at 3 in the morning. The chroniclers wrote that she passed mildly like a lamb, easily like a ripe apple from a tree. Peaceful, gentle. But was it really? Or was that just the final story they told to protect the legend? Because if we're being honest, Elizabeth's death was anything but peaceful. It was the culmination of a lifetime of fear, control, and secrets. It was the end of a woman who chose power over love, isolation over intimacy, and mystery over truth. And it all started decades before, in a childhood so traumatic it would shape everything she became. But that's where our story really begins. To understand why Elizabeth stood in that room refusing to die, we need to go back. Back to when she was just a little girl who watched her father destroy everything she loved. Back to the moment innocence died and survival became everything. So take a deep breath, get comfortable, because in the next part of our story, we're travelling back to 1536, to a child of 2 years old whose mother just lost her head, and who would learn, far too young, that love is the most dangerous thing in the world. London, May 19th, 1536. A small girl with red gold hair sits in the nursery at Hunsdon House, playing with her toys. She's 2 years and 8 months old. Her name is Elizabeth, and this morning she's wearing a new dress, probably yellow or white, the colours she'll love her whole life. She doesn't know it yet, but while she's stacking blocks or humming to herself, 20 miles away at the Tower of London, her mother is kneeling on a scaffold. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, places her head on the block. The French swordsman raises his blade, and in one swift stroke Elizabeth becomes an orphan. Here's what haunts me about this moment. Elizabeth was too young to remember it happening. She wouldn't have memories of her mother's face, her voice, her touch. But she would grow up knowing, always knowing, that her father had her mother killed. Can you imagine that? Not my parents divorced or my mother died of illness. No. My father, the King of England, ordered my mother's head cut off because he wanted a son and she gave him me instead. Let's back up for a second, because to understand Elizabeth's childhood, you need to understand just how spectacular her fall was. When she was born on September 7th, 1533, she was a princess. Capital P. Her father, Henry VIII, had literally broken with the Catholic Church, defied the Pope, and torn England apart just to marry her mother. Anne Boleyn wasn't just some mistress. She was the woman Henry risked everything for. And when baby Elizabeth arrived, there were celebrations. Not as many as there would have been for a boy, sure, but still. She was legitimate. She was royal. She had a household, servants, a governess named Lady Margaret Bryan who absolutely adored her. Lady Bryan wrote beautiful things about baby Elizabeth. She called her as toward a child and as gentle of conditions as ever I knew any in my life. Translation: this was a smart, sweet-natured little girl, a normal, happy toddler, but that happiness had an expiration date, approximately 32 months. Because here's the thing about Henry VIII. He didn't just want a son, he was obsessed with it, paranoid about it. The Tudor dynasty was new, fragile. Henry's own father had won the crown in battle only 50 years earlier. Without a male heir, Henry believed England would descend into civil war. So when Anne Boleyn failed to produce a son, when she miscarried a male baby in January 1536, Henry's love curdled into hatred, and he decided she had to go. Now, the charges against Anne were absurd. Adultery with 5 different men, including her own brother. Treason, witchcraft, all fabricated. But it didn't matter. Henry wanted her gone, and what Henry wanted, Henry got. So, on May 19th, 1536, Anne Boleyn was beheaded. She was 29 years old, and little Elizabeth. That same day, Parliament declared her illegitimate. She went from Princess Elizabeth to Lady Elizabeth overnight. She lost her title, her place in succession, her claim to anything. One day you're royal, the next day you're nobody. Lady Bryan was beside herself. She wrote desperate letters to Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, saying essentially, "What do I do with this child? She's growing so fast she doesn't have clothes that fit. She has neither gown nor kirtle nor petticoat. I don't know what her status is anymore. Is she a princess? A bastard? Do I treat her with honour or not?" Can you imagine being the adult in charge of a toddler whose mother was just executed and whose father suddenly won't acknowledge her? The confusion, the fear, the absolute horror of it. But here's something remarkable. Lady Bryan also wrote, "She is as toward a child as ever I knew any in my life. I trust the King's grace shall have great comfort in her grace, for she is as gentle a child as ever I knew." Even after all this trauma, Elizabeth was still sweet, still gentle, still lovable. But something had shifted. At 2 years old, she learned the first rule of survival: don't trust anything, because the people who are supposed to love you can disappear without warning. And it got worse. Oh, it got so much worse. Because Henry didn't stop at one wife. 11 days after Anne Boleyn's execution, 11 days, Henry married Jane Seymour. Imagine being Elizabeth, barely 3 years old, and suddenly there's a new mother in the palace. Except Jane wanted nothing to do with her. Jane's job was to produce the son Anne couldn't. And in October 1537, she did. Prince Edward was born, and suddenly Elizabeth had a little brother who mattered more than she ever would. Jane died 12 days after childbirth, and for a while there was no new queen. But then came wife number 4, Anne of Cleves. That marriage was annulled after 6 months. Lucky for Anne, she kept her head. And then came Catherine Howard. Now this is where Elizabeth's childhood trauma becomes a pattern, a nightmare on repeat. Catherine Howard was young, maybe 17 when she married Henry. She was Anne Boleyn's first cousin, which means she was Elizabeth's relative too. And for a brief moment, maybe Elizabeth thought this young, lively woman might be kind to her. But Catherine made a fatal mistake. She fell in love with someone else. Or maybe she was just young and stupid. Either way, Henry found out. Elizabeth was 8 years old in 1542 when Catherine Howard was arrested for adultery. Think about that. At 8, you're old enough to understand what's happening, old enough to see the guards come, to hear the screams, to watch another woman disappear. And on February 13th, 1542, Catherine Howard was beheaded. Same place her cousin Anne Boleyn died 6 years earlier. The Tower of London soaked in the blood of Elizabeth's relatives. Do you see the pattern forming? Mother figure, betrayal, execution. Mother figure, betrayal, execution. At 8 years old, Elizabeth had watched this cycle twice. Is it any wonder she grew up terrified of marriage? Terrified of intimacy? Terrified of giving anyone, especially a man, power over her? By 1543, when Henry married his 6th and final wife, Catherine Parr, Elizabeth was 10 years old. And here's where something beautiful happened. Catherine Parr was different. She was educated, intelligent, genuinely kind. She was around 31 years old, mature, not a teenager, and she took Elizabeth under her wing. She brought Elizabeth back to court. She arranged for excellent tutors. She treated Elizabeth not as a bastard or a threat, but as a brilliant young girl who deserved an education. Under Catherine's care, Elizabeth flourished. She studied Latin, Greek, French, Italian, and Spanish. She read philosophy, theology, history. Her tutor, Roger Ascham, later wrote that Elizabeth had a mind exempt from female weakness and a memory that kept firmly what it had quickly grasped. Translation: This girl was a genius, and for the first time since she was 2 years old, Elizabeth had something resembling a family. But even Catherine couldn't protect Elizabeth from the fundamental terror of her existence. Because here's what people don't talk about enough. Elizabeth lived every day knowing she could be killed. Her father had killed her mother on false charges. He'd killed Catherine Howard on adultery charges. He could kill Elizabeth any time he wanted for any reason, or no reason at all. One wrong word, one perceived slight, one rumour or accusation, and she could end up on that scaffold. The stress of this, of living under constant surveillance, constant danger, constant uncertainty, manifested physically. Historical records show that even as a young teenager, Elizabeth suffered from what they called stomach aches and watery humours. She had fainting spells, violent headaches, insomnia, what we'd now recognise as anxiety, PTSD, stress-induced illness. Her body was keeping score of the trauma even as she maintained that careful, controlled exterior. When Henry VIII finally died in January 1547, Elizabeth was 13 years old. She'd survived. She'd outlived the monster. But she'd also learned some terrible lessons. She learned that love makes you vulnerable. She learned that men have absolute power over women's bodies and lives. She learned that the moment you trust someone, the moment you let them close, they can destroy you. And she learned that survival means control. Total, absolute control over your image, your words, your emotions, your body. Now you might think, okay, the nightmare's over, Henry's dead, Elizabeth is safe with Catherine Parr, things will get better. And for a brief shining moment they did. Catherine and Elizabeth moved to Chelsea Manor in London. Elizabeth had her books, her studies, her routine. Catherine had remarried a charming, handsome man named Thomas Seymour. For a few months it almost felt like a normal household, almost like a real family. But if Elizabeth thought the worst was behind her, if she thought she could finally let her guard down, if she thought she was safe now, well, she was about to learn the hardest lesson of all, because Thomas Seymour had noticed how Elizabeth was growing up. He'd noticed she was 14 now, with red gold hair and her mother's dark eyes. And what happened next would teach Elizabeth that sometimes the danger doesn't come from executioners or angry kings. Sometimes it comes into your bedroom before dawn, wearing a nightgown and calling it affection. Chelsea Manor, winter 1547. Dawn hasn't broken yet, but 14-year-old Elizabeth is already awake. She's learned to wake early, to get dressed before the sun rises, to surround herself with her ladies-in-waiting. Why? Because if she doesn't, he'll come. Thomas Seymour, her stepfather. The man who enters her bedroom in his nightgown while she's still in bed. The man whose hands find their way to places they shouldn't, and the truly horrifying part. At first, his wife, Elizabeth's beloved Catherine Parr, thought it was funny. Now I need you to understand something before we go further. What I'm about to describe isn't a scandal or a romance or an affair. Those are the words Tudor historians used for centuries because they didn't have better language. But we do. What happened to Elizabeth at Chelsea Manor was grooming. It was sexual harassment, it was abuse, and it was perpetrated by a man who was supposed to protect her. Thomas Seymour was about 39 years old, more than twice Elizabeth's age. He was the brother of Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife, which made him Prince Edward's uncle. Charming, handsome, ambitious, and as it turned out, a predator. He'd been in love with Catherine Parr for years, but when Henry VIII wanted to marry her, Thomas had to step aside. You don't compete with a king. But now Henry was dead, and within weeks, scandalously, inappropriately, shockingly fast, Thomas married Catherine. She was the wealthiest woman in England, the Dowager Queen, and living with her at Chelsea Manor was her teenage stepdaughter Elizabeth. Here's where it starts to get dark. Thomas would wake early, before the household stirred, and go to Elizabeth's bedroom. The door would open, and there he'd be in his nightgown, barely dressed. Elizabeth's governess, Cat Ashley, witnessed this and recorded what happened. Thomas would approach Elizabeth's bed. If she was still sleeping, he'd wake her. If she was awake, she'd pretend not to notice him. And then he'd start. Tickling. That's what they called it. But think about what that means. A grown man, partially dressed, leaning over a teenage girl's bed, putting his hands on her body, running his fingers along her ribs, her sides. Elizabeth would be in her nightgown, vulnerable, half asleep, and he'd tickle her. Sometimes he'd slap her on the buttocks, playfully, casually, like it was nothing, like he had every right. Cat Ashley was horrified. She told Thomas to stop, that this was inappropriate. His response? By God's precious soul, I mean no evil, and I will not leave it. In other words, I'm not doing anything wrong, and you can't stop me. That's the language of someone who knows he has power and intends to use it. But here's what makes this so much more complicated, so much more psychologically twisted. Catherine Parr knew about it. Cat Ashley reported it to her. And Catherine's initial response was to join in. She thought it was playful, innocent fun. On at least one occasion, she held Elizabeth down while Thomas cut the girl's black morning dress to shreds with a knife. Can you imagine that scene? A 14-year-old girl pinned down by her stepmother, while her stepfather cuts her clothes off her body with a blade, and everyone's pretending it's a game. Now, why would Catherine do this? Some historians think she was trying to diffuse the situation, to make it seem innocent by being present. Others think she was in denial, desperately wanting to believe her new husband was just being affectionate with her stepdaughter. Or maybe, and this is darker, maybe she was participating to keep Thomas's attention, to compete with a teenage girl for her own husband's focus. Whatever the reason, it's heartbreaking. This was the woman who'd been kind to Elizabeth, who'd given her an education, who'd made her feel safe. And now she was betraying her. Elizabeth responded the only way she could. She started waking before dawn. She'd dress completely, call her ladies to attend her, and make sure she was never alone. Because what could she actually do? She couldn't report Thomas to the authorities. Thomas was the authority. He was Lord High Admiral, a member of the Privy Council, the uncle of the king. Elizabeth was a 14-year-old former princess, declared illegitimate, with no power, no protection, no real legal standing. Who would believe her? Who would help her? And there's evidence that Elizabeth tried to signal for help in the only way she could. Around June 1548, Catherine wrote a letter to Thomas and asked Elizabeth to give it to the messenger. Before handing it over, Elizabeth wrote 3 Latin words on the side of the paper. Nolito me tangere. Let him not touch me. Think about that. She originally wrote noli me tangere, do not touch me, a direct command, but then she crossed it out and wrote nolito instead, changing it to third person, making it less direct, less confrontational, because even in her desperation, she knew she couldn't afford to be too bold. She was trying to tell Catherine, trying to warn her, trying to say please make him stop, but in a way that wouldn't get her in more trouble. And it didn't work. Or maybe Catherine didn't notice. Or maybe she noticed and didn't want to see what it meant. By spring 1548, things had escalated. Catherine was pregnant, finally expecting the child she'd always wanted, but she was also starting to see her husband differently. One day, she found Thomas and Elizabeth in a close embrace. The historical records don't specify whether he was forcing himself on her or whether it appeared consensual, but Catherine saw enough, and she finally sent Elizabeth away. In May 1548, Elizabeth was sent to live with Sir Anthony Denny and his wife Joan in Cheshunt, Hertfordshire. She must have felt a confusing mix of emotions. Relief to escape Thomas, guilt for being sent away, grief at losing Catherine, shame at what had happened, confusion about whether it was her fault. Because that's what abuse does. It makes you question everything. Was she encouraging him? Did she do something wrong? Should she have fought harder? These are questions she couldn't have answered at 14, questions that would haunt her for life. On September 5th, 1548, Catherine Parr gave birth to a daughter, Mary Seymour, but something went terribly wrong. Childbirth fever, probably sepsis. Catherine became delirious, hostile, saying strange things. On September 7th, Elizabeth's 15th birthday, Catherine Parr died. She was 36 years old. Elizabeth lost the closest thing to a real mother she'd ever had. Can you imagine Elizabeth's feelings? Grief, absolutely. But also relief that she'd been sent away before Catherine died, because at least she wasn't there in that house with Thomas alone, and maybe, just maybe, guilt. Did Catherine die because of the stress? Because of what happened with Thomas? Because Elizabeth didn't try harder to stop it? These are irrational thoughts, but trauma isn't rational. Thomas Seymour didn't mourn long. With Catherine dead, he set his sights back on Elizabeth. Now, 15 years old, about to turn 16, second in line to the throne. If he could marry her, he'd have incredible power. He started plotting. He tried to gain influence over the young King Edward. He gave Edward pocket money, made promises, undermined his own brother, the Lord Protector, and he tried to reach out to Elizabeth to continue whatever relationship he thought they had. But on January 17th, 1549, everything came crashing down. Thomas was caught trying to break into King Edward's private apartments at Hampton Court Palace with a loaded pistol. He killed the king's dog when it barked. His intentions were never entirely clear: kidnapping, assassination, intimidation. But it was treason, no question. Thomas Seymour was arrested, and immediately suspicion turned to Elizabeth. Had she been part of the plot? Had she agreed to marry him? Was she planning to seize the throne? On January 21st, Sir Robert Tyrwhitt arrived at Hatfield House to interrogate her. He also arrested Cat Ashley and Thomas Parry, Elizabeth's cofferer, taking them to the Tower for questioning. Now this is where we see Elizabeth's brilliance under pressure. She was interrogated for weeks, relentlessly. They wanted her to confess to planning marriage with Seymour, to admit they'd been intimate, to implicate herself in treason. And she gave them nothing. Nothing. At 15 years old, she ran circles around trained interrogators. Tyrwhitt reported back, frustrated. In no way will she confess any practice by Mistress Ashley or the cofferer concerning my Lord Admiral, and yet I do see it in her face that she is guilty, and do perceive as yet she will abide more storms ere she accuse Mistress Ashley. He could see she was hiding something, could see it in her face, but he couldn't break her. Elizabeth's responses were masterful. She admitted to discussing the possibility of marriage with Cat Ashley, but insisted she had never agreed to anything without the council's permission. She acknowledged Seymour's morning visits, but framed them as inappropriate behaviour she'd tried to avoid. She protected her servants while protecting herself. She showed just enough vulnerability to seem honest, while revealing nothing that could be used against her. On March 20th, 1549, Thomas Seymour was beheaded on Tower Hill. He was about 40 years old. He never admitted to wrongdoing, he never showed remorse. And Elizabeth? She emerged from the scandal alive, but forever changed. The trauma of those months, the abuse, the interrogation, the near execution, taught Elizabeth lessons she'd never forget. Men are dangerous. Love is a weapon. Trust no one. Marriage means losing power. Your body is a liability. Control everything or die. She spent the rest of Edward's reign presenting herself as the perfect Protestant princess. She wore plain clothes, carried prayer books, stayed quiet, stayed safe. She'd learned to perform, to hide the real Elizabeth behind layers of careful presentation. And she'd learned that showing any vulnerability, any desire, any human need could get you killed. But the Seymour scandal did something else too. It planted a question in everyone's mind, a rumor that would follow Elizabeth for the rest of her life. There were whispers that she'd gotten pregnant, that the mysterious illness in 1561 with the swelling body was actually childbirth, that somewhere there was a secret child. These rumors were probably false, but they meant that Elizabeth's virginity, her body, her private life would always be subject to speculation and scrutiny. And so when she became queen 9 years later at age 25, Elizabeth understood something most monarchs didn't. Her body wasn't just her body, it was a political battlefield. Marriage wasn't romance, it was surrender. And the only way to keep power was to keep everyone guessing, keep everyone wanting, keep everyone at arm's length, forever. But before she was Gloriana, before she was the Virgin Queen, before she was the most powerful woman in Europe, she had to survive her teenage years. She had to navigate her brother's short reign, her sister Mary's dangerous rule, and the constant threat of execution. And through it all, she'd be haunted by one question. Could she ever trust anyone enough to let them close? Or would she spend her life alone, standing guard over her own heart, just like she stood guard in that chamber at Richmond Palace, refusing to lie down? The crown was coming for her, but with it would come suitors, marriage proposals, and one man in particular, a man she'd known since childhood, a man she'd loved in secret, a man whose very existence would force Elizabeth to choose between her heart and her throne. November 17th, 1558. Elizabeth is 25 years old, kneeling under an oak tree at Hatfield House reading her Bible. A messenger arrives on horseback, muddy and breathless. Her sister Mary is dead. Elizabeth is now Queen of England. According to legend, she quotes Psalm 118 in Latin. A domino factum est illud et est mirabile in oculis nostris. This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvellous in our eyes. But before she can even process the magnitude of what's just happened, before she can take her first breath as queen, the men around her start asking the question that will haunt her for the next 44 years. Your Majesty, whom will you marry? Not if, whom? Because in 1558 the idea of a woman ruling alone was almost unthinkable. Queens were supposed to be wives. They were supposed to produce heirs. They were supposed to defer to their husbands on matters of state. Elizabeth had other ideas. Within days of her accession, the marriage proposals started flooding in. And I mean flooding. Philip II of Spain, her former brother-in-law who'd been married to her sister Mary, proposed immediately. He was probably the most powerful man in Europe, ruling Spain, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and vast territories in the Americas. Marrying him would have given England incredible protection and wealth. But Elizabeth had watched her sister Mary marry Philip. She'd seen how unpopular it made Mary, how the English hated having a Spanish king. She'd seen how Philip treated Mary, with cold indifference, using her for political gain. So Elizabeth politely declined. Then came Eric XIV of Sweden. He sent a steady stream of marriage proposals and even dispatched his brother, Duke John, to court Elizabeth in person. Eric was young, reasonably handsome, Protestant, and quite possibly insane, but we didn't know that part yet. Elizabeth kept him dangling for years with maybe, possibly, let me think about it. She never had any intention of marrying him, but keeping Sweden interested kept them as potential allies against France and Spain. Archduke Charles of Austria proposed. The Earl of Arran from Scotland proposed. The Duke of Anjou, who was 22 years younger than Elizabeth, proposed. His brother, the Duke of Alençon, also proposed. Foreign ambassadors filled her court, each one carrying marriage offers. each one trying to read whether the Queen was serious about matrimony or just playing games. And her own counsellors, they were losing their minds. William Cecil, her chief adviser, a brilliant but deeply traditional man, believed that a queen absolutely had to marry. For one thing, England needed an heir. For another, how could a woman possibly run a country alone? In their minds, she needed a husband to help her make decisions, to lead armies, to handle the really important masculine stuff like war and diplomacy. The fact that Elizabeth was clearly capable of all this herself didn't matter. She was a woman. Women needed husbands. End of discussion. Except Elizabeth wasn't having it. In her first speech to Parliament in 1559, she said something extraordinary. "And in the end, this shall be for me sufficient that a marble stone shall declare that a queen, having reigned such a time, lived and died a virgin." She was 25 years old, barely on the throne for months, and she was already declaring she might never marry. Parliament thought she was being dramatic. Surely she'd change her mind. Surely once she met the right man, she'd do her duty, right? Wrong. Because Elizabeth had learned something her counsellors hadn't. Marriage, for a queen, wasn't romance. It was political suicide. Look at what happened to Mary, Queen of Scots, who married 3 times and ended up imprisoned. Look at Mary Tudor, who married Philip and became a figure of mockery. Elizabeth had watched every important woman in her life lose power, lose freedom, or lose their head because of marriage. She'd learned from her mother, from Catherine Howard, from Catherine Parr, from her own near destruction at the hands of Thomas Seymour. Marriage meant vulnerability. Marriage meant giving a man legal control over your body, your property, your decisions. And Elizabeth hadn't survived 25 years of danger just to hand her crown and her life to some husband. But she couldn't just say that, could she? She couldn't stand in front of Parliament and say, "Marriage is a trap and I refuse." So she developed a strategy. She became England's most eligible bachelorette, perpetually considering marriage, perpetually negotiating, perpetually keeping everyone hoping. It was brilliant. By staying unmarried but available, she kept multiple countries invested in England's favour. Spain thought they might win her. France thought they had a chance. Austria was hopeful. And while they were all competing for her hand, Elizabeth was actually ruling, making decisions, consolidating power. But the pressure was relentless. In 1563, Parliament officially petitioned her to marry. They gave her all the logical arguments. The succession was uncertain. The country needed an heir. She had a duty to her people. Elizabeth's response was masterful. She told them, "I am already bound unto a husband, which is the kingdom of England." Can you imagine the balls it took to say that? To essentially tell Parliament, "I'm married to you, to England, to my job. You're my spouse. Deal with it." But behind the public confidence, Elizabeth was terrified. Because on October 10th, 1562, she nearly died. She caught smallpox, one of the deadliest diseases of the era. At first, it seemed like a bad cold. She took a bath to feel better, but within days she was burned with fever. By October 16th, she couldn't speak. She was barely conscious. Her doctors thought she was dying. Her counsellors panicked because there was no clear heir. Who would rule if Elizabeth died? The country could descend into civil war. They started arguing over succession. Some wanted Catherine Grey, a Protestant. Others reluctantly considered Mary, Queen of Scots, a Catholic. The divisions were immediate and terrifying. Elizabeth, lying on what everyone thought was her deathbed, did something remarkable. She demanded they make Robert Dudley, her childhood friend, her closest companion, the Lord Protector of England, with an income of £20,000 a year. That's more than £4.6 million in today's money. She trusted him to settle the succession and save England from chaos. and she took that moment to formally declare that her relationship with Dudley had never been improper, which, by the way, nobody believed, but we'll get to that later. Now here's the thing about smallpox. It was called the speckled monster for good reason. It killed about 30% of people who caught it. And for those who survived, it left deep, pockmarked scars all over the face and body. Elizabeth was 29 years old, at the height of her attractiveness, still being courted by kings and princes, and she was terrified that smallpox would destroy her face. Her doctors subjected her to something called the red treatment. They wrapped her entire body from neck to toe in red cloth, believing it would prevent scarring. Then they placed her near a raging fire. It was a Japanese technique that had been used in Europe since the 12th century, and scientifically speaking, it was complete nonsense. But psychologically, it probably helped Elizabeth feel like she had some control over what was happening to her body. She survived. By October 25th, she was back at work, but the scars remained, not severe, but noticeable, and something else changed. Her lady-in-waiting, Mary Sidney, had nursed Elizabeth through the illness. Mary caught smallpox too, but Mary wasn't as lucky. The disease left her face so horribly disfigured that she withdrew from court life entirely, spending the rest of her days in seclusion. Elizabeth never forgot that sacrifice. For the rest of her life, she broke protocol to visit Mary rather than summoning her to court, because she knew Mary couldn't bear to be seen. The smallpox crisis should have convinced Elizabeth to marry immediately and produce an heir while she still could. Instead, it seemed to strengthen her resolve to remain single. Maybe the illness reminded her of her mortality, of how fragile the human body is. Maybe seeing Mary Sidney's ruined face reinforced that beauty, youth, and fertility were temporary. Or maybe, and this is darker, maybe the illness confirmed what Elizabeth already suspected about her own body, that something was wrong, that marriage and childbirth were never really options for her. Parliament tried again in 1566. They were more aggressive this time. They essentially said, "We won't discuss anything else until you promise to marry." It was political blackmail. Elizabeth was furious. She summoned the delegation and gave them a verbal lashing they'd never forget. She told them her marriage was her business. She reminded them she'd already given more to England than most monarchs, and she said, and I love this, "I will never break the word of a prince spoken in a public place for my honour's sake. And therefore I say again, I will marry as soon as I can conveniently, if God take not him away with whom I mind to marry, or myself, or else some other great let obstacle happen." Translation, I'll marry when I feel like it, if the guy doesn't die, if I don't die, or if something else doesn't come up. She basically promised everything and nothing simultaneously. It was political genius. But what was really happening here? Why was Elizabeth so resistant? Her counsellors genuinely believed she was physically capable of marriage and childbirth. They thought she was just being stubborn, difficult, perhaps traumatized by her upbringing, and maybe that was part of it. But there's another possibility that historians are only now beginning to seriously consider. What if Elizabeth wasn't just emotionally opposed to marriage? What if there was a physical reason she couldn't marry? Contemporary sources hint at this. Spanish ambassadors reported rumours that she was barren. Some said she had a malady in one of her breasts. In 1561, just before the smallpox, she'd been mysteriously bedridden with an illness that caused her body to swell. What was that about? Pregnancy? A tumour? A hormonal condition? We don't know because Elizabeth never let doctors examine her properly, never kept records of her private health, never explained. But the whispers persisted, and Elizabeth must have heard them. Can you imagine living with that? Knowing that people were speculating about your body, your fertility, your most private medical issues? knowing that any admission of physical inability would be seen as weakness, as proof that a woman couldn't rule alone. She had to maintain the fiction that she could marry and have children, even if she knew or suspected that she couldn't. So she turned it into a weapon. If she couldn't be the conventional queen who married and produced heirs, she'd become something else entirely, something unprecedented. She'd become the Virgin Queen. The imagery started slowly. Portraits began showing her in white, the colour of purity. Her clothing became increasingly elaborate. Huge ruffs, embroidered gowns, so many jewels you could barely see the person beneath. She was transforming herself from Elizabeth the woman into Elizabeth the icon. The courtiers started calling her Gloriana. Poets compared her to the Virgin Mary, to the moon goddess Diana, to mythical beings. It wasn't just flattery, it was propaganda. Elizabeth was creating a cult of virginity around herself, making her unmarried state not a weakness, but a source of mystical power. In 1576, Parliament tried one more time, another petition for marriage. By now, Elizabeth was 43 years old, probably past childbearing age anyway, but they couldn't let it go. Her response this time was different, calmer, more resigned. She told them, "If I were a milkmaid with a pail on my arm whereby my private person might be little set by, I would not forsake that single state to match myself with the greatest monarch." In other words, even if she were nobody, she still wouldn't want to marry. It was the closest she ever came to admitting the truth. But here's what's fascinating. Even as she rejected the idea of a husband, even as she built this identity as the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth wasn't entirely opposed to love. She had favourites. Men she flirted with, danced with, gave nicknames to. She kept them close but never close enough. She'd learned from Thomas Seymour that intimacy was dangerous. She'd learned from watching her father's marriages that love could turn lethal. So she created a safe version: courtly love, platonic devotion, political theatre that looked like romance but never risked anything real. The genius of Elizabeth's strategy was that she convinced everyone, foreign kings, her own counsellors, maybe even herself, that she was making a noble sacrifice, that she wanted to marry but was putting England first, that she was the devoted bride of her nation suffering the loneliness of spinsterhood for the good of her people. It was a beautiful lie, or maybe it was partly true. Maybe she did long for companionship, for love, for the normal life she could never have. Maybe the loneliness wasn't strategy. Maybe it was real, and she just learned to make it look like choice. By the time she reached her 40s, the question of marriage faded. It was clear Elizabeth would never do it, and surprisingly, the kingdom didn't collapse. England thrived, trade expanded, the arts flourished. Shakespeare wrote his plays during Elizabeth's reign. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 made England a major naval power. Elizabeth had proved that a woman could rule alone, that virginity could be power, that marriage wasn't necessary for greatness. But there was a cost, because while Elizabeth was busy being Gloriana, while she was performing the role of the Virgin Queen for her subjects, while she was rejecting suitors and managing the political theatre of courtship, there was one man who'd been there all along, one man she'd known since childhood, one man who made her laugh, who challenged her, who maybe, just maybe, was the person she would have chosen if choosing had been possible. And his name was Robert Dudley, and his wife had just died under the most suspicious circumstances imaginable. September 8th, 1560, Cumnor Place, Oxfordshire. It's a Sunday, a fair day in the nearby town of Abingdon. The lady of the house, Amy Robsart Dudley, does something strange. She insists that all her servants, every single one, leave for the fair. They're confused. She's not feeling well. She's been complaining of pain in her chest for weeks. Why would she want to be alone? But she's adamant. Go. All of you. Enjoy the fair. When they return that evening, they find her at the bottom of a short flight of stairs, her neck broken, her head injured, unmistakably dead. Amy Dudley was 28 years old, and her death would destroy any chance Elizabeth had of marrying the only man she ever truly loved. Let me take you back to understand why this death mattered so much. Robert Dudley and Elizabeth had known each other since childhood. They were born just 3 days apart in 1533. He on June 24th, she on September 7th. Their families moved in the same circles. Robert's father was John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, one of the most powerful men in England. The children grew up around court, probably played together, certainly knew each other's faces before they knew what power and politics really meant. But here's where their connection becomes profound. In 1553, Robert's father made a catastrophic mistake. He tried to put Lady Jane Grey on the throne instead of Mary Tudor. It was treason. Jane Grey reigned for 9 days before Mary seized power. And suddenly Robert Dudley found himself in the Tower of London, condemned to death, waiting for execution. His father was beheaded. His brother Guildford, Jane Grey's husband, was beheaded. Robert watched his family destroyed, expecting his turn to come any day. And who else was in the tower at the same time? Elizabeth, also accused of treason, also expecting execution, also living day by day wondering if this would be her last. They were both in their early 20s. Both had survived traumatic childhoods. Both knew what it felt like to be one wrong move away from the scaffold, and historians believe they saw each other during this time. That in the darkest period of their lives they found each other, a shared understanding that no one else could possibly comprehend. They both survived. Mary eventually released them both. Robert in 1554, Elizabeth carefully watched until 1558. And when Elizabeth became queen in November 1558, one of her first acts was to appoint Robert Dudley as Master of the Horse. Now, this might sound like just a fancy title for someone who manages the royal stables, but it was actually one of the most important positions at court. The Master of the Horse was constantly at the Queen's side. He helped her mount and dismount horses. He organised her travels. He accompanied her everywhere. It meant daily intimate access to the monarch. Within months the rumours started. Elizabeth and Robert were spending an unusual amount of time together. They rode horses together. They danced together. They laughed together. In 1559, Elizabeth had Robert's bedchambers moved next to her own apartments. Not down the hall, not in another wing, next door, connected. The Spanish ambassador, Alvaro de Quadra, started sending reports back to Spain that were increasingly scandalized. He wrote that Elizabeth was in love with Lord Robert and never lets him leave her. Here's where it gets complicated. Robert Dudley was married. He'd married Amy Robsart back in 1550 when they were both teenagers. He was 17, she was 18. It was apparently a love match, what Elizabeth's advisor William Cecil dismissively called a carnal marriage, begun for pleasure rather than a strategic alliance. They seemed happy at first, but then Robert's fortunes changed dramatically. When he was released from the Tower and Elizabeth became queen, Robert went to court. Amy stayed in the country. Why didn't Amy come to court with her husband? That's one of the great mysteries. Some historians think she was too low-born, not polished enough for court life. Others think she was already sick. There are mentions of her suffering from a malady in one of her breasts, which many historians interpret as breast cancer. Or maybe, this is darker, maybe Robert was already in love with Elizabeth and didn't want his wife around. Whatever the reason, by 1559 Robert and Amy were living completely separate lives. She moved from house to house, staying with friends and relatives, never settling anywhere. He was at court, dancing with the Queen, wearing the Queen's colours, receiving the Queen's gifts, and everyone was talking about it. The Spanish ambassador wrote something chilling in April 1559. a full year and a half before Amy died. He reported that people were saying Elizabeth would marry Robert Dudley if his wife were perchance to die. Think about that. People were openly speculating about Amy's death while she was still alive. And then in September 1560, de Quadra wrote something even more disturbing. Lord Robert has sent to poison his wife. Certainly all the Queen has done with us, and will do with all the rest in the matter of her marriage, is only to keep Lord Robert's enemies and the country engaged with words until this wicked deed of killing his wife is consummated. So by September 8th, 1560, when Amy was found dead, suspicion was immediate and universal. Did Robert kill her? Did Elizabeth know? Were they planning to marry as soon as Amy was out of the way? The scandal was explosive. Let's look at the facts of Amy's death, because they're genuinely mysterious. She sent all her servants to the fair. Why? The stairs she supposedly fell down were described as short and broad, not the kind of steep staircase where a fatal fall would be expected. The coroner's report, which was found in 2008 after being lost for centuries, describes 2 dints, 2 injuries on her head. Her neck was broken. But here's what's strange. If you throw yourself downstairs to commit suicide, you'd expect multiple injuries, bruising, broken bones. If you accidentally trip and fall, same thing. But Amy's injuries were concentrated. 2 head wounds and a broken neck, suggesting a single violent impact or blow. Modern medical experts have proposed various theories. Some say she had breast cancer that had spread to her bones, making them brittle. A spontaneous fracture could have caused her to fall. Others suggest suicide, that she was depressed knowing she was dying and threw herself down hoping to break her neck. One controversial theory suggests an aortic aneurysm burst from slight pressure, causing instant death, and then she fell. And then there's murder, that someone on Robert's orders or acting independently killed her and made it look like an accident. The coroner's jury deliberated for months. The inquest began on September 9th, but they kept adjourning day after day, probably under enormous pressure. The jury included at least one man, John Stevenson, who was employed by Robert Dudley. How impartial could they be? Finally, in August 1561, nearly a year later, they ruled it misfortune. An accident. But nobody really believed it. Robert's behaviour after Amy's death is interesting. He immediately sent his steward Thomas Blount to Cumnor to investigate and organise an inquest. He demanded that the inquiry be thorough and honourable. Was this genuine grief and innocence? Or was it a PR move to cover his tracks? We'll never know. What we do know is that Robert didn't attend Amy's funeral. His chaplain, Dr. Francis Babington, gave the sermon and at one point said Amy had been pitifully slain. He later claimed he'd tripped in his speech, a very convenient slip of the tongue. For Elizabeth, this was a nightmare. She was already deeply in love with Robert. Everyone knew it. She knew it. He knew it. And now he was free to marry her. But the scandal made it impossible. If she married Robert now, it would look like they'd conspired to murder Amy. England would never accept it. Foreign powers would use it as propaganda. The Queen of England married her lover after killing his wife. Elizabeth's legitimacy, already questioned because of her mother's execution, would be completely destroyed. William Cecil, her adviser, must have been relieved. He'd been terrified that Elizabeth would marry Robert, which Cecil thought would be a disaster politically. Now it couldn't happen. The Spanish ambassador gleefully wrote that the scandal had ruined Lord Robert's chances of ever marrying the Queen, and he was right. But here's what breaks my heart about this story. Elizabeth genuinely loved Robert Dudley. We have evidence of this. After she recovered from smallpox in 1562, she named him as Lord Protector. We talked about this earlier, and formally declared that their relationship had never been improper. She was trying to defend both his honour and hers. but the declaration itself proves how much she cared. Why bother defending his reputation if he didn't matter? Throughout the 1560s and 70s, Robert remained her closest favourite. She gave him Kenilworth Castle. She made him Earl of Leicester in 1564. She visited him constantly. When she was negotiating marriage with foreign princes, Robert would be standing right there watching, knowing that Elizabeth was going through the motions but would never actually choose anyone else. It must have been torture for both of them. And then there's that mysterious illness in 1561, the one where Elizabeth was bedridden with swelling in her body. This happened about a year after Amy's death. Some historians have speculated, controversially, that Elizabeth was pregnant with Robert's child. There's even a story about a man named Arthur Dudley who showed up in Spain in 1587 claiming to be their secret son, born during that 1561 illness. He said he'd been given to a family named Southern to raise, that he'd only discovered his true parentage as an adult. The Spanish took him seriously enough to interrogate him, but most historians think it's fiction. Still, the fact that the rumour existed tells you something about how people perceived Elizabeth and Robert's relationship. The tragedy is that they loved each other but could never be together. Not because of Amy's death, though that certainly sealed the deal, but because Elizabeth couldn't marry anyone without losing power, and Robert would always carry the suspicion of having killed his wife. They were trapped by circumstances, by politics, by scandal, by Elizabeth's own physical secrets. Robert eventually married other women, Lettice Knollys in 1578, in secret because he knew Elizabeth would be furious, and she was. Furiously, spectacularly jealous. She banned Lettice from court. She raged at Robert, but she didn't cut him off completely. She couldn't. He was the one person who knew her before she was queen, who'd shared the tower with her, who understood what it cost her to rule alone. When Robert Dudley died on September 4th, 1588, Elizabeth was devastated. She locked herself in her room and refused to come out until her counsellors threatened to break down the door. She kept his last letter to her in a small box beside her bed, and it was found there when she died in 1603, 15 years after Robert's death. On the outside of the letter, in Elizabeth's handwriting, were the words, "His last letter." She'd read it, saved it, kept it close with the rest of her life. Can you imagine that kind of love? The kind that survives scandal, impossibility, decades of separation? The kind where you keep someone's letter for 15 years after they're gone, where you read it when you're alone and remember what might have been. Elizabeth sacrificed everything for power. Her chance at love, at marriage, at children, at normal human connection. And the one person she would have chosen, the one person she couldn't have, haunted her for the rest of her life. But here's the question that keeps me up at night. Why couldn't she marry him? After all the scandal died down, after years had passed, why not? She was the queen, she could do whatever she wanted. And the answer, I think, brings us back to Elizabeth's body, to the secret she was hiding. Because if Elizabeth had a physical condition that made marriage impossible, if she couldn't consummate a marriage, couldn't have children, couldn't fulfill the basic expectations of what marriage meant in the 1500s, then marrying Robert would have exposed that secret. Better to be the virgin queen who chose England over love than the broken woman who couldn't be a wife even if she wanted to. So Amy Robsart's death didn't just destroy Elizabeth's chance to marry Robert. It gave her the perfect excuse. She could blame the scandal, the suspicion, the politics. She could play the martyr, the queen who sacrificed her heart for her country's good. And no one would ever have to know the real reason, the physical reason. The secret that made marriage to anyone, even Robert, impossible from the start. But what was that secret? What was Elizabeth hiding about her body? What made her so desperate to avoid doctors, so terrified of intimacy, so determined to die standing up rather than let anyone examine her? That's where our story goes next, into the darkest, most suppressed medical theories about Elizabeth I. Theories that make her choice of loneliness not noble but necessary, not martyrdom but survival. There's a letter that exists in the Spanish archives. It's dated September 1559, written by the Count de Feria, Spain's ambassador to England. He's reporting back to King Philip II about Queen Elizabeth, and he writes something shocking. It is the common opinion, confirmed by certain physicians, that this woman is unhealthy, and it is believed certain that she will not bear children. This is less than a year into Elizabeth's reign. She's 26 years old, and already people are saying she can't have children. Not won't, can't. What did they know? What did they see? And more importantly, what was Elizabeth desperately trying to hide? Let me be clear about something before we go further. What I'm about to discuss isn't scandalous gossip or tabloid speculation. This is serious medical history, theories proposed by actual physicians and historians who've studied the evidence for decades. And while we'll never know for certain what, if anything, was medically different about Elizabeth's body, the clues are there. Written in diplomatic reports, recorded in eyewitness accounts, hidden in her own desperate attempts to control how people saw her. Let's start with what people actually observed about Elizabeth. She was tall for a woman of her time, about 5'4" or 5'5", which might not sound tall to us, but in the 1500s that was notably above average. She had long, slender limbs, a somewhat angular face, a prominent nose, and multiple sources describe her as having a masculine bearing, strong, commanding, with a deep voice that could fill a room. Now, on their own, none of these things mean anything. Plenty of women are tall, have strong features, have commanding voices, but taken together, combined with other evidence, they start to paint a picture. In 1985, a physician named Robert C. Berman published a paper in Medical Hypotheses that sent shockwaves through Tudor history circles. He proposed that Elizabeth may have had something called complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, or CASE. Now, before your eyes glaze over at the medical terminology, let me explain what this means in simple terms. CAIS is a condition where a person has XY chromosomes, typically associated with males, but their body doesn't respond to testosterone, so they develop externally as female, often with normal female appearance, but they don't have a uterus or ovaries. They have internal testes instead. They typically don't menstruate, they can't get pregnant, and they often don't discover this condition until they try to have children and can't. In Elizabeth's time, there would have been no way to diagnose this, no way to explain it, no language for it. A woman with CAS would just be told she was barren or defective or cursed. Now, does this mean Elizabeth definitely had CAS? No. We can't diagnose a 400-year-old corpse without examining it, and Elizabeth made sure no examination would ever happen. But let's look at the evidence that makes historians consider this possibility. First, there's that mysterious 1561 illness where Elizabeth was bedridden with swelling in her body. If she had internal testes instead of ovaries, they could have developed tumours or cysts, causing swelling and pain. This could explain why she was so sick, why her body swelled, and why, despite rumours of pregnancy, no baby ever appeared. Second, there are multiple references to her not menstruating normally. In Tudor times, menstruation was called the flowers or monthly terms, and there are hints in letters and reports that Elizabeth's cycle was irregular or absent. One Spanish report mentions that Elizabeth suffered with her menses, which could mean painful periods, or could mean she didn't have them at all and people noticed. Third, there's her appearance. People with CAS often grow taller than average because testosterone, even though their bodies don't respond to it, still affects bone growth. They often have long limbs and somewhat masculine features. Does this description sound familiar? But here's the most compelling evidence: Elizabeth's absolute terror of marriage. Not political reluctance, terror. And not just reluctance to consummate a marriage. There are reports that she couldn't. In the 1570s, when she was negotiating marriage with the Duke of Alençon, there were whispers among the French ambassadors that consummation would be impossible. One diplomat wrote cryptically that there were physical obstacles to the marriage that made it pointless to pursue. Think about what it would have been like for Elizabeth if she did have a condition like this. She would have grown up knowing something was wrong. Maybe she didn't menstruate when other girls did. Maybe there was pain or absence of something that should have been there. In Tudor times, a woman's value was tied entirely to her ability to produce children. A woman who couldn't was seen as cursed, broken, punishment from God. Can you imagine the shame, the fear, the absolute necessity of keeping this secret? And here's the darkest part. If Elizabeth knew she couldn't have children, then every marriage negotiation she conducted for 44 years was a lie. Every time she told Parliament, "I will marry when I can conveniently," she knew it would never happen. Every time she strung along a foreign prince, made him believe he had a chance, she was performing an elaborate deception. Not because she was cruel, but because admitting the truth would have ended her reign. A queen who couldn't produce an heir was useless. She'd be deposed, married off forcibly to someone who could cure her, or worse. Now, case is just one theory. There are others. Some historians suggest Elizabeth might have had vaginal agenesis, a condition where the vagina and uterus don't develop properly. Others propose various hormonal disorders. Some think she had severe endometriosis, which causes excruciating pain during menstruation and can make pregnancy impossible. Or maybe she had a tilted uterus, or scarring from an infection, or any number of other conditions that we now understand but Tudor physicians couldn't diagnose or treat. What we do know for certain is this: contemporary sources believed she had a physical problem. It wasn't just speculation. The Spanish ambassador de Quadra wrote that she had a malady in one of her breasts, and that she was unlikely to live long. Now, some historians interpret malady in the breast literally as breast cancer, but others point out that in Tudor medical language, breast could refer to the entire chest cavity, including the reproductive organs which were thought to be connected to the breasts. So, malady in the breast might have been code for a reproductive disorder. And there's another piece of evidence that's often overlooked. Elizabeth refused medical examinations her entire life. When she was sick with smallpox in 1562, she had to be unconscious before doctors could attend to her properly. Throughout her reign, whenever she was ill, she resisted seeing physicians. She wouldn't let them examine her body. She'd accept medicines, but not physical examination. Why? What was she afraid they'd discover? After her death, her Lady of the Bedchamber refused to allow an autopsy. The official reason was to preserve the myth of Virgin Queen. But what if there was something specific she was protecting? What if Elizabeth had made her attendants promise that no one would ever examine her body, because that examination would reveal something that would tarnish her legacy forever? Here's what breaks my heart about this. If Elizabeth did have a physical condition, she spent her entire life in pain. Physical pain from whatever was wrong with her body, emotional pain from the shame and secrecy, and the loneliness of knowing she could never be intimate with anyone, never trust anyone with the truth, never let anyone close enough to discover what she was hiding. Imagine being Elizabeth. You're a brilliant, capable woman who happens to have been born with a medical condition you can't understand, can't explain, can't fix. You watch other women marry, have children, have normal lives. You want love. You're human. Of course you want love. You fall for Robert Dudley, and he loves you back. but you know that marrying him means he'll discover your secret on your wedding night. And then what? Will he be disgusted? Will he annul the marriage? Will he tell people? Will your entire kingdom find out that their queen is defective? So you make a choice. You decide that loneliness is safer than exposure, that power is more reliable than love, that if you're going to be alone anyway, you might as well be alone on a throne, with control, with dignity, with a story you get to write yourself. You transform your inability to marry into a choice, your barrenness into virginity, your secret shame into mystical power, and it works. You become Gloriana, the Virgin Queen married to England, beyond human desires, almost divine. You create an image so powerful that 400 years later, people still believe it. They believe you chose this. They believe it was noble sacrifice rather than desperate necessity. But late at night, alone in your chambers, you read Robert Dudley's last letter. You remember what it felt like to love someone and be loved back. You wonder what your life might have been like if your body had been different, if you'd been normal, if you'd been able to be just a woman instead of always, always, always having to be a queen. There's a particular cruelty in Elizabeth's situation that I think we don't talk about enough. She lived in a time when women's bodies were seen as inferior versions of men's bodies, when any deviation from the normal female body was seen as monstrous, when being unable to have children made you worthless. And if Elizabeth had a condition like Cass, where she had XY chromosomes, internal testes, masculine features, can you imagine how she would have been treated if anyone found out? In an age that burned women for witchcraft, that saw women's bodies as inherently sinful, that believed a woman's only purpose was childbearing, they would have said she wasn't really a woman at all. They would have said she had no right to rule. They would have used it as proof that female monarchy was against God's plan. They might have killed her, almost certainly would have dethroned her. So she protected herself the only way she could, with secrecy, with performance, with an elaborate costume that hid her real body behind layers of clothing, makeup, and mythology. And maybe, just maybe, this is why she refused to lie down at the end. Because lying down meant vulnerability, meant doctors, meant examination, meant the possibility that even in death her secret might be discovered. Better to die standing in control, taking the truth to her grave. We'll never know for certain what Elizabeth's body was hiding. The evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. The theories are educated but unprovable. And maybe that's how she wanted it. Maybe after a lifetime of people speculating about her body, her fertility, her sexuality, she earned the right to take her secrets with her, to leave us wondering, to maintain the mystery even in death. But whether she had K's or vaginal agenesis or endometriosis or something else entirely, or nothing at all, whether her choice of virginity was medical necessity or political strategy or psychological trauma or genuine preference, one thing is certain. Elizabeth took a situation that could have destroyed her and turned it into her greatest weapon. She took what might have been weakness and made it power. She took shame and made it glory. And that transformation, from broken to brilliant, from vulnerable to victorious, that's the real story of Elizabeth I. Not the virgin part, the survivor part, the woman who looked at impossible circumstances and said, "Fine, I'll make this work for me instead of against me. I'll make you worship my virginity instead of pitying my barrenness. I'll make you believe I'm choosing this instead of knowing I have no choice." It was the greatest PR campaign in history, and it required painting her face white, piling on jewels and padding, creating an image so elaborate and artificial that no one could see the real woman underneath. Which is exactly what we're going to explore next. How Elizabeth literally poisoned herself to maintain the image. How the mask she wore to hide her secrets slowly killed her. How vanity and vulnerability and fear combined to create a slow, toxic death that started decades before she finally refused to lie down in that chamber at Richmond Palace. Picture a woman sitting at her dressing table each morning, and before her sits a bowl of white paste. Not cream, not powder, paste. Thick, heavy, chalky. She takes a brush, or sometimes just her fingers, and begins to apply it to her face, layer after layer after layer. It goes on her forehead, her cheeks, her nose, her chin, her neck, down to her collarbones. By the time she's finished, the paste is so thick you could scratch your initials into it. So thick it cracks when she smiles. So thick it literally weighs down her face. This is Venetian ceruse, and this is how Elizabeth painted herself every single day for over 40 years. What she didn't know, what nobody knew, was that she was slowly poisoning herself with lead. And by the time people figured it out, 31 years after her death, it was far too late. Let's talk about what Venetian ceruse actually was, because the recipe is genuinely horrifying. You take white lead, which is lead carbonate, a chemical compound, and mix it with vinegar. The acid reaction creates this white paste. Then you add things to make it stick better, egg whites sometimes, or a bit of borax. The result is a brilliant opaque white that covers everything. Scars, blemishes, age spots, veins, natural skin tone gone. You become a blank canvas of perfect porcelain white. In Tudor and Elizabethan England, pale white skin was the beauty standard. It signified wealth and status because it meant you didn't work outside in the sun. Only peasants had tan skin. Ladies of quality were expected to be pale as milk, smooth as marble. And after Elizabeth's smallpox in 1562, when she was left with light scarring on her face, Venetian ceruse became not just cosmetic, it became necessity. But here's where it gets interesting. Elizabeth didn't just use this makeup to cover scars, she used it to create an image. Remember, she was building the cult of the Virgin Queen, turning herself from Elizabeth the woman into Elizabeth the icon. The white face became part of her brand. It made her look otherworldly, ageless, almost supernatural. In portraits from her later years, her face is so white it seems to glow. She doesn't look human. She looks like a statue, like a goddess, like something beyond mere flesh and blood, which was exactly the point. Let me walk you through Elizabeth's morning makeup routine, based on accounts from her ladies in waiting. First, she'd wash her face, or rather have it washed for her, with a mixture that might include things like ground almonds, mercury sublimate, or borax. Already we're getting into dangerous territory, but let's continue. Then the white lead paste would be applied, thickly. Some accounts suggest it could be up to an inch thick on her face. An inch. That's not makeup. That's a mask. A literal mask of toxic metal covering her skin, sealing it, suffocating it. But we're not done. On top of the white base, she'd add rouge to her cheeks and lips, made from red ochre or cochineal beetles, which was actually one of the less dangerous things she put on her face. Her eyebrows might be darkened with kohl, and then, because the white lead paste had a matte finish that could look chalky, sometimes they'd add a glazing agent on top to make it shiny. What was this glaze made of? Sometimes egg white, sometimes sublimate of mercury. Or poison, basically. Now, what does lead poisoning actually do to your body? Because this is where Elizabeth's story becomes a slow-motion tragedy. Lead is a neurotoxin. It accumulates in your bones, your blood, your brain. And the symptoms? They're insidious. They creep up on you so gradually that you don't realize what's happening until it's too late. The first thing lead poisoning affects is your digestive system. Elizabeth suffered from terrible stomach problems throughout her later years. She had what they called choleric episodes, probably severe cramping, nausea, digestive distress. She'd lose her appetite, refuse to eat. Her physicians thought it was stress or melancholy. They had no idea she was literally being poisoned by her own face. Next comes the hair loss. Lead disrupts the hair growth cycle, causes follicles to die. By her 60s, Elizabeth had lost most of her hair. Eyewitness accounts describe her as nearly bald. This is why she started wearing elaborate red wigs, to cover the devastating hair loss. And here's the cruel irony. She was losing her hair because of the makeup she wore to look beautiful, so she had to pile on more artifice. The wigs, the padding, the increasingly elaborate costumes, to hide what the first artifice had destroyed. And then there are the teeth. Oh God, the teeth! Lead poisoning destroys tooth enamel and causes gum disease. By her 50s, Elizabeth's teeth were rotting. They turned black. They fell out. Her breath became notoriously bad, so bad that courtiers dreaded having to stand close to her. She dealt with this by stuffing her mouth with scented handkerchiefs during important meetings and audiences. Can you imagine meeting with ambassadors and having to keep perfumed cloth in your mouth to mask the smell of your own decay? Sir John Harrington, her godson, visited Elizabeth in November 1602, just 4 months before she died. He wrote about the encounter, and his description is heartbreaking. She is quite disfavoured and unattired, and these troubles waste her much. Disfavoured meant ugly, basically. Unattired meant poorly dressed, dishevelled. This was Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the woman who'd spent decades crafting her image, and now she was falling apart. But the worst effects of lead poisoning hit the brain. Memory problems, confusion, mood swings, personality changes. Elizabeth in her later years became increasingly paranoid, increasingly volatile. She'd fly into rages over small things. She'd sink into deep depressions. She had trouble sleeping. Lead poisoning causes insomnia. She'd forget things, lose track of conversations. Her counsellors noticed. Robert Cecil, her chief advisor, had to manage her increasingly erratic behaviour carefully. Now, was all of this just old age? Partly, yes. She was nearly 70 when she died. But modern medical analysis suggests that chronic lead poisoning significantly accelerated her decline. The levels of lead she was exposing herself to, daily for decades, not just on her face, but absorbed through her skin into her bloodstream, were toxic enough to cause serious neurological damage. And here's the truly horrifying part. It was a vicious cycle. The white lead paste damaged her skin. It caused dryness, cracking, lesions, premature aging. So she had to use more makeup to cover the damage, which caused more damage, which required more makeup. By her 60s, Elizabeth's real face, underneath all the layers, was probably scarred, discoloured, ravaged by decades of toxic cosmetics. She couldn't stop using the makeup because her face without it was worse than her face with it. She was trapped by her own image. The mask she'd created to project power had become a prison. And the really sick part? She probably knew. By the 1590s, there were whispers that these cosmetics were dangerous. Some women had died from using them, documented cases of sudden illness after heavy makeup use. But Elizabeth couldn't stop. Stopping meant showing her real face. Showing her real face meant shattering the illusion, and the illusion was the only power she had left. Let me read you another account, this one from the French ambassador André Hureau de Metz, who met with Elizabeth in 1597 when she was 64 years old. He wrote, "She was very much painted. She had in her ears 2 pearls with very rich drops. Her bosom was somewhat wrinkled. As for her face, it is and appears to be very aged. It is long and thin, and her teeth are very yellow and unequal. Many of them are missing so that one cannot understand her easily when she speaks." Think about that description. This is a foreign ambassador being diplomatic, and even he can't hide his shock at her appearance. The makeup is so thick he describes her as painted like a doll. Her chest, which would have been exposed in the low necklines of the era, shows her real age with wrinkled skin. Her teeth are yellow, missing, making her hard to understand. This is the woman who 40 years earlier had been described as attractive, graceful, commanding. Lead poisoning had destroyed her. But perhaps the most telling detail is that her face appears to be very aged. Not as aged, appears to be, because he can't see her real face through all the paint. He's looking at a mask and describing what he can see through the cracks. There's a particular tragedy in Elizabeth's relationship with her appearance that I think captures her whole life. She was vain, deeply, profoundly vain. She loved beautiful clothes, jewellery, flattery. She commissioned portraits that showed her eternally young, eternally perfect. She banned mirrors from her rooms in her later years because she couldn't stand to see her real reflection. But this vanity wasn't just personal weakness, it was survival strategy. In a world that judged women entirely on their looks and fertility, Elizabeth had turned her appearance into a political tool. Every outfit, every jewel, every layer of white paint was part of a calculated performance. She was telling her subjects, I am perfect, I am eternal, I am worthy to rule. And if maintaining that performance meant slowly poisoning herself? Well, what choice did she have? The alternative was admitting she was human, aging, vulnerable. And vulnerable queens don't last long. Here's something that makes me want to scream. Venetian ceruse wasn't officially classified as a poison until 1634. That's 31 years after Elizabeth died. In 1634, someone finally did the research and said, hey, maybe we shouldn't put lead on our faces because it's killing us. But for Elizabeth, for all the women of her generation, that knowledge came too late. She spent her entire adult life, from her 20s when she started covering her smallpox scars until her death at 69, applying toxic metal to her face every single day for nearly 50 years. The cumulative effect on her body, her brain, her health must have been catastrophic, and she had no idea. She thought she was making herself beautiful, powerful, ageless. She didn't know she was committing slow suicide. By the time we get to 1603, to those final days at Richmond Palace, Elizabeth is a shell of herself. The hair is gone, hidden under wigs. The teeth are gone, her mouth collapsed, her speech slurred. The skin underneath the makeup is ruined beyond repair. Her memory is failing. Her body is failing. And still she puts on the white face. Still she maintains the image. Because without the image, who is she? What does she have left? This is why she wouldn't let doctors examine her. Not just because of whatever physical secret she might have had regarding her reproductive system, but because any examination would require removing the makeup. And removing the makeup meant exposing the damage. The real damage. The face she'd destroyed in service of the crown. And she couldn't bear to let anyone see that. Not even at the end, especially not at the end. So when she stood in that chamber refusing to lie down, refusing to sleep, refusing to surrender, she was maintaining one final performance. The queen who never yields, the virgin queen who remains perfect until the last breath. Even if that perfection was literally toxic, even if it had been killing her for decades, even if the mask had become more real than the face underneath. And this brings us to something even darker, because the makeup, the costume, the elaborate performance, that was all external. But what about the internal performance? What about the way Elizabeth locked away her emotions, her desires, her humanity? What about the way she forced herself to stand for hours when she was exhausted, to smile when she wanted to scream, to project strength when she felt like breaking? That kind of performance doesn't just damage your face, it damages your soul. There's a portrait of Elizabeth painted around 1592 called the Ditchley Portrait, and if you look at it closely, it's almost unsettling. Elizabeth stands with her feet planted on a map of England, literally standing on top of her kingdom. She's wearing white and gold covered in jewels, her hand resting near her heart. Behind her, the sky is divided. On one side, stormy darkness. On the other, golden light. And her face? Perfectly white, perfectly smooth, perfectly ageless, even though she's 59 years old when this is painted. The message is clear. I am England. England is me. We are one body. And what this portrait doesn't show, what no portrait ever showed, was the calculated genius behind this image. Because Elizabeth didn't just refuse to marry, she turned that refusal into the most sophisticated power play in European history. She made virginity her weapon, and she wielded it with ruthless precision. Let me show you how this worked in practice. It's 1579. Elizabeth is 46 years old, probably past childbearing age, but she's conducting the most serious marriage negotiation of her life. The suitor is Francois, Duke of Alençon, brother to the King of France. He's 24 years old, 22 years younger than Elizabeth. He's also, by all accounts, quite short and severely disfigured by smallpox scars. People called him the Frog. Not to his face, obviously, but still. Elizabeth receives his portraits, his letters, his ambassadors. She claims to be smitten. She writes passionate letters back. She says things like, "my frog," with apparent affection. The French court is thrilled. If they can marry Alençon to Elizabeth, they'll have enormous influence over England. The Spanish are terrified for the same reason. Elizabeth's own councillors are divided. Some think it's a good match, others think it's ridiculous. William Cecil, her chief advisor, is privately sceptical but publicly supportive. And Elizabeth, she's playing them all. She keeps the negotiation going for years. Alençon even visits England twice. She's seen holding hands with him, dancing with him. There's a scene where she supposedly takes a ring from her finger and gives it to him, implying a private engagement. The French ambassador rushes to write home that the marriage is confirmed. The entire court buzzes with the news, and then nothing happens. The marriage is never finalized. Elizabeth keeps finding reasons to delay. First she needs Parliament's approval, then there are religious complications, then there are financial details to work out. Then, political circumstances have changed. She keeps Alençon dangling for 4 years. 4 years of maybe, soon, we're working on it. And during those 4 years, France remains friendly to England because they think a marriage is imminent. Spain doesn't attack because they think England might become France's ally, and Elizabeth maintains her power without giving anything up. When Alençon finally realizes he's being played and leaves England for good in 1582, Elizabeth allegedly cries. She writes him sad letters. She calls him her dearest love. Is she genuinely emotional? Or is this the final performance, making sure he doesn't leave angry and turn France against her? We'll never know. But what we do know is that by the time Alençon dies in 1584, at only 29 years old, Elizabeth has successfully used this romance to keep France as an ally for years without sacrificing an ounce of her independence. This is what I mean by weaponized virginity. Elizabeth understood something profound. As long as marriage was theoretically possible, she had leverage. Every eligible bachelor in Europe was a potential alliance. Every negotiation was a way to buy time, extract concessions, play rivals against each other. The moment she actually married someone, that leverage disappeared. She'd be locked into one alliance, alienate everyone else, and, worst of all, have to share power with her husband. So she pioneered a new strategy: perpetual availability. She was always considering marriage, always negotiating, always dangling the possibility, but never ever delivering. It was brilliant, it was manipulative, and it kept her in power for 44 years. But here's where it gets psychologically complex. Elizabeth didn't just use this strategy with foreign princes, she used it with her own courtiers, specifically with the men she kept close, her favourites. These weren't just advisors or friends, they were carefully managed sources of emotional fulfillment that never crossed into real intimacy. They were safe love, controlled love, love that couldn't destroy her. We've already talked about Robert Dudley, the great love of her life, but he wasn't the only favourite. There was Christopher Hatton, who Elizabeth nicknamed Lids for reasons history doesn't record. She made him Lord Chancellor even though he had no legal training purely because she enjoyed his company. He was supposedly so devoted to her that he never married, spending his entire life in her service. When he was ill, Elizabeth visited him personally. When he died in 1591, she grieved genuinely. Then there was Sir Walter Raleigh. Oh, Walter Raleigh. The story everyone knows about him is probably apocryphal, the one where he throws his expensive cloak over a puddle so Elizabeth can walk across without getting her shoes wet. But even if that specific story is fake, it captures something true about their dynamic. Raleigh was charming, brilliant, ambitious, and he played the game of courtly love perfectly. He wrote poetry to Elizabeth, comparing her to the moon goddess Diana. He called her Cynthia. She gave him monopolies, patents, estates. She let him lead expeditions to the Americas. And then in 1591 he secretly married one of Elizabeth's ladies-in-waiting, Elizabeth Throckmorton. When the Queen found out, she was furious. She threw both of them in the Tower of London. Why? Because Raleigh was supposed to be devoted only to her. His marriage was a betrayal, not of romantic feelings necessarily, but of the performance. He was supposed to play his role as the devoted courtier, and instead he'd chosen a real relationship with a real woman. Elizabeth released them eventually, but Raleigh was banished from court for years. The message was clear. You can love me or you can love someone else, but you can't do both. And then there was Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. This one ended in blood, and it shows the dark side of Elizabeth's favourite system. Essex was young, handsome, charismatic, and the stepson of Robert Dudley, so there was already a connection there. Elizabeth was in her 50s when she first took notice of him. He was in his early 20s. The age gap was enormous, but Elizabeth adored him. She gave him titles, money, military commands. She let him get away with behaviour that would have gotten anyone else executed. Essex, for his part, seemed to genuinely care for Elizabeth. But he was also ambitious, hot-tempered, and increasingly frustrated by his position. See, being Elizabeth's favourite was a golden cage. Yes, you got wealth and status, but you were also constantly on display, constantly performing devotion, constantly dancing attendance on a woman who would never actually be yours. And if you tried to have a life outside that dynamic, if you married, if you built independent power, if you stopped playing your role, she'd crush you. In 1598, during a council meeting, Essex and Elizabeth had a massive argument about who should be appointed to lead forces in Ireland. It got heated, and at some point Essex did the unthinkable. He turned his back on the Queen. This was a massive insult. You never turn your back on the monarch. Elizabeth slapped him across the face, and Essex, probably shocked, definitely furious, put his hand on his sword. He didn't draw it, but the gesture was enough. You don't threaten violence against the Queen. The room went dead silent. Everyone expected Essex to be arrested immediately. But Elizabeth remarkably let it go. She still cared for him too much. She sent him to Ireland anyway to lead the campaign against rebellion there. Essex botched the campaign completely. Instead of fighting, he negotiated an unauthorised truce with the rebel leader. Then he abandoned his post and rode back to England with a small group of supporters. He burst into Elizabeth's private chambers at Nonsuch Palace early one morning, before she was dressed, before her wig was on, before her makeup was applied. He saw her real face, her real, aging, damaged face. Can you imagine that moment? Elizabeth, who'd spent decades controlling her image, suddenly exposed. Standing there in her dressing gown, probably nearly bald, her skin showing its real damage, no white paint, no jewels, no costume, and Essex, young, handsome Essex, seeing her like that. The humiliation must have been excruciating. Elizabeth recovered quickly. She greeted him calmly, told him to change his muddy clothes, even seemed pleased to see him at first. But that image of her real face, her vulnerability, her age, must have haunted her. And Essex had crossed a line. Not just by abandoning his command, not just by bursting into her chambers unannounced, but by seeing her without the mask. Over the next months their relationship deteriorated. Elizabeth put Essex under house arrest. He grew increasingly paranoid, increasingly desperate. On February 8th, 1601, he attempted a rebellion, a pathetic, half-hearted attempt to seize the court and force Elizabeth to remove his enemies from power. It failed within hours. Essex was arrested, tried for treason, and on February 25th, 1601, he was beheaded. He was 34 years old. Elizabeth signed his death warrant. She had to. Treason was treason, and she couldn't show mercy without appearing weak. But after his execution, she fell into a deep depression. She'd loved him in whatever complicated, controlled way she was capable of loving, and she'd killed him, added him to the long list of people she'd cared for who'd ended up dead because of her. Do you see the pattern? Every man Elizabeth let into her inner circle, every favourite she allowed herself to care for, either died or betrayed her, or had to be banished when they tried to have real lives. Robert Dudley died in 1588. Christopher Hatton died in 1591. Walter Raleigh was banished and eventually executed. Robert Devereux was beheaded. The only way to stay safe in Elizabeth's orbit was to remain devoted, celibate, and ultimately alone, just like she was. Because here's the truth about Elizabeth's weaponized virginity. It wasn't just a political strategy. It was a cage. She'd built this identity, the Virgin Queen married to England, and now she was trapped inside it. She couldn't have real relationships because they would threaten her power. She couldn't show vulnerability because it would be exploited. She couldn't let anyone truly close because closeness meant danger. So she created these controlled relationships with her favourites, where she got some emotional fulfillment but never had to risk anything real. And the cost was loneliness. Profound, devastating loneliness. In her speeches to Parliament, Elizabeth often used the language of marriage and virginity to justify her refusal to wed. In 1599, near the end of her reign, she said, "I have already joined myself in marriage to a husband, namely the Kingdom of England." It's a beautiful line, very poetic. But think about what it actually means. She's saying she's married to a concept, to a piece of land, to a political entity that can't hold her, can't love her back, can't fill the human need for connection and intimacy. She turned this loneliness into a brand, made it noble, made it sacrifice, told everyone she was suffering for them, giving up personal happiness for England's good. And maybe she believed it herself. Maybe she convinced herself that serving her country was enough, that power was better than love, that the performance had become real. But late at night, alone in her chambers, did she believe it? Or did she know, deep down, that the cage she'd built was killing her just as surely as the lead paint on her face? By her 60s, Elizabeth was increasingly isolated. So many of the people who'd known her as a person, not as a queen but as Elizabeth, were dead. Robert Dudley, gone. Christopher Hatton, gone. William Cecil, her longtime adviser, died in 1598. Catherine Carey, her cousin and friend, gone. One by one, everyone who remembered her before the performance, who'd seen her real face, who'd known her real self, gone. and she was left with nothing but the image, the Virgin, the Queen, Gloriana, a woman who'd traded her humanity for power and couldn't remember if it had been worth it. In her final years, she barely slept. She stood for hours, pacing, thinking, remembering. The loneliness had become physical. It wasn't just emotional isolation. It was the actual absence of human touch, human warmth, human connection. For decades, she'd been surrounded by people but utterly alone, touched by thousands but intimate with no one, loved by a nation but cherished by nobody. And now, facing death, she understood what she'd given up, what the performance had cost. January 1603. Elizabeth chooses Richmond Palace for what she somehow knows will be her final days. Not Whitehall with its grand halls and political theatre, not Greenwich where she was born, not Hampton Court with its memories of smallpox and near death. Richmond, the palace her grandfather Henry VII built, where he died nearly a century ago. She tells her ladies she's going there because she can best trust her sickly old age to its quiet chambers. But I think she chose it because she wanted to die where Tudor history began, to close the circle, to go home. At first she seems okay. Tired, yes. Melancholy, certainly. But still functional. She still receives ambassadors, still handles business, still maintains the performance. There's even a report of her scolding a Venetian diplomat about piracy, her old fire flashing briefly. But those who know her well can see a change. Something has broken inside her. Something essential. And they all know when it happened. February 25th, 1603, Catherine Howard, Countess of Nottingham, dies. Now you might be thinking, wait, didn't we already talk about Catherine Howard being executed? That was a different Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's fifth wife, beheaded back in 1542. This Catherine Howard was Elizabeth's friend, her lady-in-waiting, her cousin, actually. Catherine's mother was Mary Boleyn, Anne Boleyn's sister, which made Catherine Elizabeth's first cousin once removed. They'd known each other for decades. Catherine had been there through everything, the dangerous years under Mary I, the triumph of Elizabeth's coronation, the heartbreak of Robert Dudley, the execution of Essex, everything. And now she was gone. Elizabeth's grief was immediate and overwhelming. She shut herself in her rooms, she refused to see people, she stopped eating properly. Her attendants whispered that this was different from her usual moods. This wasn't political depression or calculated melancholy. This was real grief, raw and uncontrolled, and Elizabeth, who'd spent her entire life controlling everything, couldn't control this. But here's what makes Catherine's death especially devastating. There's a story, probably apocryphal, but it's circulated widely, that on her deathbed Catherine finally confessed something to Elizabeth. Years ago, when the Earl of Essex was condemned to death, he'd allegedly sent Elizabeth a ring, a specific ring she'd once given him with the promise that if he ever returned it, she'd pardon him no matter what he'd done. But the ring never reached Elizabeth. According to the story, Essex gave it to Catherine's husband, the Earl of Nottingham, to deliver. And Nottingham, who hated Essex, never gave it to the Queen. He pocketed it, let Essex die, and Catherine had known about it all along, but only confessed as she was dying. Now, historians debate whether this story is true. There's no solid evidence for it. But what matters is that Elizabeth might have believed it. She might have spent her final days thinking, I killed Essex unnecessarily. He tried to ask for mercy. He used the token I gave him, and my own relatives betrayed us both. The guilt, the rage, the sense of betrayal, it would have been unbearable. Sir Robert Carey, who visited Elizabeth on March 19th, recorded what he saw. He found her sitting on cushions on the floor of her withdrawing chamber. Not in a chair, not in bed, on the floor like she'd collapsed there and couldn't get up. When she saw him, she took his hand, her grip weak and cold, and said, "No, Robin, I am not well." And then she sighed. Carey counted between 40 and 50 deep sighs in just a few minutes, each one sounding like she was releasing something she'd held too long. 40 sighs. Imagine being so full of grief, of exhaustion, of decades of suppressed emotion that you sigh 50 times in a conversation. Her ladies reported that she'd been sitting on these cushions for 10 days. 10 days, refusing to move to her bed, refusing to eat more than a few bites, refusing to let doctors examine her. When they asked what was wrong, she wouldn't say. When they begged her to rest, she shook her head. One anonymous observer wrote, "She could be prevailed on neither by entreaties, arguments, nor artifices, to take the least medicine and scarcely sufficient nourishment to support life. She could get no sleep whatever." Think about what no sleep whatever means. We're not talking about insomnia where you sleep a little, wake up, sleep a little more. We're talking about someone who refused to close her eyes, who stood or sat awake for days on end, who fought sleep like it was an enemy. And why? Because Elizabeth had figured something out that her doctors hadn't. She knew that if she lay down, if she let herself sleep, she might not wake up. And more than that, she knew that the moment she surrendered to her bed, the moment she admitted she was dying, it would all be over. Not just her life, but her control over her death. So she stood. Hour after hour, day after day, her legs must have been screaming, her body must have been begging for rest. But Elizabeth had spent 70 years choosing willpower over weakness, control over comfort, and she wasn't about to stop now. Her attendants became desperate. They spread cushions all over the floor, hoping that when she finally collapsed, at least she wouldn't hurt herself. And eventually, inevitably, she did collapse. But even then, even lying on the floor, unable to stand anymore, she wouldn't move to the bed. She just lay there on the cushions, staring at nothing, occasionally muttering to herself. What was she muttering? According to reports, she was talking to people who weren't there. Mary Queen of Scots appeared to her, the cousin she'd kept in prison for 19 years before finally signing her death warrant in 1587. Elizabeth supposedly wept and said she had never wanted Mary's death, that she'd never given proper consent. Whether this was true or her mind rewriting history, we can't know. But the guilt was real. The ghost was real, at least to her. The Earl of Essex haunted her too. Young, handsome Essex who'd loved her and betrayed her, and whom she'd killed. According to Sir Robert Carey, she shed many tears and sighs, manifesting her innocence that she never gave consent to the death of that queen. Wait, did he write queen? Was he talking about Mary or mixing up his notes? Either way, Elizabeth was being tormented by the deaths she'd ordered, the violence that had kept her safe, the executions that had preserved her throne. In her delirium, they all came back. And I wonder, did Anne Boleyn appear too? Did Elizabeth see her mother, the woman she couldn't remember but who'd shaped her entire life? Did she apologize? Did she ask why? Did she finally at the end get to mourn the mother she had never been allowed to grieve for? By March 21st, Elizabeth had been on these cushions for nearly 3 weeks. She was barely conscious. Her throat was swollen and painful. Her mouth was dry. She couldn't swallow properly. Modern doctors, looking at these symptoms, think she might have had a throat infection that developed into sepsis, or maybe pneumonia. Or maybe it was just the cumulative effect of 70 years of trauma, stress, and lead poisoning finally shutting her body down. Robert Cecil, son of William Cecil, her longtime advisor, came to see her. Robert was small, even by Tudor standards. He'd been born with a crooked back, and Elizabeth had always been somewhat dismissive of him, trusting him but never loving him the way she'd loved his father. Now, faced with a dying queen who wouldn't go to bed, Robert tried to use his authority. "Your Majesty," he said, probably trying to sound firm, "you must go to bed. Must. The worst word you can say to a monarch. The word that removes choice, removes power, removes agency." Elizabeth's eyes snapped to his face. Even weak, even dying, she could still summon royal rage. "Must," she said, her voice sharp despite her physical state. "Must is not a word to use to princes, little man. Little man. Let that sink in. She's dying. She can barely speak. And she still has the presence of mind to put Robert Cecil in his place. To remind him that even now, even like this, she is the queen, and he is not." And then, because Elizabeth never could resist twisting the knife, she added, "You know I must die, and that makes you so presumptuous. In other words, you're only being bold because you think I'm about to die and you can get away with it. You're circling like a vulture. I see you. I know what you are." It's the kind of devastating read that only someone who's spent 44 years managing ambitious men could deliver, and it shut Robert Cecil up immediately. But later that day, they finally convinced her to go to bed. It took Charles Howard, Earl of Nottingham, Catherine's widower, the man who'd possibly betrayed Essex, using what by fair means, what by force, according to Carey's account. They physically moved her, lifted her from the cushions and placed her in bed, and Elizabeth must have known this was it, that once she was in that bed she'd never leave it, that she'd lost the final battle. For 3 days she lay there, sometimes conscious, sometimes not. Archbishop Whitgift, an old man himself now, came to pray with her. He knelt by her bedside and prayed for hours. When he tried to leave, his knees aching, his back stiff, Elizabeth made signs for him to continue. She couldn't speak any more, but she held his hand and squeezed it when he spoke of heaven, of rewards, of peace. She needed to hear it, needed to believe that something waited for her beyond this life, because this life had given her power but taken everything else. Her counsellors gathered on March 23rd. They needed to know who Elizabeth wanted as her successor. The question that had haunted her entire reign, that she'd refused to answer for 44 years, now had to be resolved. James VI of Scotland, Mary Queen of Scots' son, the child of the woman Elizabeth had executed, was the logical choice. But would Elizabeth choose the son of her enemy, they asked her. She couldn't speak, but when they mentioned James's name, she raised her hand to her head, made a circular motion, a crown. She was indicating that yes, James should be king. After everything, after killing his mother, after decades of refusing to name an heir, Elizabeth gave the throne to Mary's son. The irony is almost unbearable. On March 24th, 1603, between 2 and 3 in the morning, Queen Elizabeth I died. The official account says she passed mildly like a lamb, easily like a ripe apple from a tree. Peaceful, gentle, easy. But was it? Or is that just what they told themselves? Because the truth, the real truth, is that Elizabeth died alone. Yes, there were people in the room, but she was fundamentally, absolutely alone. She'd spent 70 years building walls so high that no one could reach her, and at the end those walls were all she had. She died holding Robert Dudley's last letter, the letter he'd written to her in 1588, 15 years earlier. She'd kept it in a small box beside her bed all those years, and in her final hours someone, maybe Elizabeth herself, placed it in her hand. His last letter she'd written on it. The man she loved, the man she couldn't have, the life she couldn't live, right there with her at the end. And I can't help but wonder what she thought about in those final moments. Did she regret her choices? Did she wish she'd married Robert? Scandal be damned. Did she think about what it might have been like to have children, to have grandchildren, to have someone who loved her as a person and not as a queen? Or did she feel satisfied, triumphant even, She'd done what no woman had ever done before. She'd ruled alone. She'd kept England safe. She'd built an empire and a legend. She'd sacrificed everything personal for something larger than herself. Maybe in those last moments, she thought both things were true. That she'd made the right choice and paid too high a price. That she'd won and lost simultaneously. That she'd become Gloriana but buried Elizabeth. That the performance had been necessary and the performance had killed her. Her body was taken from Richmond to Whitehall by barge, at night, by torchlight, along the Thames. For 3 weeks she lay in state while they prepared her funeral. A life-size effigy was placed on top of her lead coffin, dressed in royal robes so lifelike that people who saw it gasped. One final performance, one last illusion, the Virgin Queen preserved forever in wood and paint, while the real Elizabeth, scarred, damaged, human Elizabeth, lay hidden in lead underneath. But even sealed in her coffin, even dead, Elizabeth couldn't escape her body's rebellion. There are reports that the coffin burst open during the 3 weeks she lay in state. The gases from decomposition built up, and the lead ceiling couldn't contain them. Her body literally broke free. Even in death she couldn't be contained, couldn't be controlled, couldn't be made to behave properly. It's almost fitting, isn't it? The woman who refused to lie down, who stood for 15 hours, who fought death until she couldn't fight anymore. Even her corpse wouldn't stay quietly in its box. On April 28, 1603, Elizabeth was buried at Westminster Abbey. Thousands lined the streets of London to watch the funeral procession. The poorer servants from the royal household marched. The scullery maids, the wine porters, the people who'd made Elizabeth's daily life possible but whom she'd barely noticed. They grieved her, really grieved her, because whatever else she was, manipulative, cold, impossible to truly know, she'd been their queen for 44 years. She was stability, she was England, and now she was gone. They placed her in the vault of her grandfather, Henry VII. But 6 years later, in 1606, her coffin was moved to the Henry VII Chapel and placed beneath a monument erected by James I, the man who'd inherited her throne. And here's the cruel irony. In 1606, James decided that Mary, Queen of Scots, his mother, the woman Elizabeth executed, should also be buried in Westminster Abbey with full honours. He built her an elaborate monument too. So now Elizabeth and Mary rest just meters apart, the two queens who spent their lives as enemies, separated by a few feet of stone for eternity. I wonder if Elizabeth would have found that funny or horrifying, maybe both. But here's what haunts me most about Elizabeth's death. She knew it was coming. For months, probably years, she had felt her body failing. And she had time to prepare, time to make peace, time to let go. But she didn't. She fought until the last possible second. She stood when she should have rested. She refused sleep. She refused food. She refused surrender. And I used to think that was about stubbornness, about pride, about a queen's refusal to show weakness. But now I think it was something else. I think Elizabeth was terrified. Not of death itself, but of what death would reveal. Because once she died there would be an autopsy, or at least people would see her body. And all those secrets she'd guarded so carefully, all the physical truths she'd hidden behind paint and costume and performance, might finally be exposed. So she stayed in control as long as possible, stood guard over her own body, made sure that even in death she'd control the narrative, and it worked. Her lady of the bedchamber refused the autopsy. The secrets died with Elizabeth, and were left, 400 years later, still guessing, still wondering, still trying to understand the woman behind Gloriana, which is exactly what Elizabeth wanted. She spent 70 years creating a mystery, and she took the answers with her when she finally allowed herself to lie down. Within hours of Elizabeth's death, something strange began happening. Documents disappeared. Letters were burned. Servants were sworn to secrecy. The official story was being written, crafted, controlled, sanitized before her body was even cold. And for the next 400 years, that official story was all we had. The Virgin Queen who sacrificed love for country, the brilliant monarch who chose England over marriage, Gloriana, good Queen Bess, perfect, untouchable, eternal. But what if that story wasn't the whole truth? What if, buried in the archives, hidden in coded diplomatic letters, lost in documents that were conveniently destroyed, there was another story, a darker, more human, more heartbreaking story, about a woman whose body held secrets too dangerous to reveal? Let me take you into the cover-up, because that's what it was. A deliberate, systematic erasure of anything that might tarnish Elizabeth's carefully constructed image. It started immediately after her death. Her Lady of the Bedchamber, we don't even know her name, she's been lost to history, refused to allow an autopsy. She gave the official reason to preserve the Queen's dignity and maintain the virgin myth. And everyone accepted this, or pretended to, because what else could they do? Elizabeth was dead, James was being crowned, and nobody wanted to start the new reign by questioning the old Queen's virtue. But here's what's suspicious. In 1603, post-mortem examinations weren't uncommon for royalty. They were expected, actually. When Henry VIII died, they examined his body thoroughly. Gruesome details about his obesity, his ulcerated leg, the state of his organs, all recorded. When Mary I died, there was speculation about whether she'd been pregnant or had tumours. Medical curiosity was normal, so why the sudden privacy for Elizabeth? What were they protecting? The answer becomes clearer when you look at what leaked out anyway. Despite the ban on autopsy, despite the careful control, certain details escaped. The embalmers, men whose job was to prepare royal bodies for burial, they saw things. And they talked, quietly, carefully, but they talked. There are accounts that Elizabeth's coronation ring had grown into her flesh. She'd worn it since 1558, 44 years, and never took it off. The skin had literally grown over it, incorporating the ring into her finger. When they tried to remove it for burial, they couldn't. They had to either cut the flesh or file the ring off. Think about what that means. For 4 decades, that ring had been part of her body, a permanent reminder of her marriage to England, so embedded she couldn't remove it even if she wanted to. There are reports that her face, beneath the inch of white lead paint, was cracked and damaged beyond recognition, that the paint had to be chiselled off her corpse, that underneath her skin was grey, mottled, destroyed by decades of toxic cosmetics. The embalmers allegedly used extra care to clean her face before placing the death mask on her, because what they saw was too horrifying to leave untouched. And then there's her hair, or lack thereof. Multiple sources confirm that by the time of her death, Elizabeth was almost completely bald. The wigs she had worn for years weren't fashion, they were necessity. And when they prepared her body, they had to dress her in a wig one final time so the effigy would look right. Even in death, the performance continued. But the most disturbing detail, the one that's whispered about in medical history texts but rarely discussed openly, is about her body's decomposition. Remember how I mentioned the coffin burst open? That's not normal, even for lead-sealed coffins. Bodies decompose, yes, but for a coffin to rupture. That suggests something unusual about the decomposition process. Some medical historians have proposed that if Elizabeth had internal testes, if she did have complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, those organs might have created abnormal decomposition gases. Or maybe she had tumours that burst post-mortem. Or maybe there was just more gas build-up than expected. But the fact remains, Elizabeth's body refused to stay sealed. Even dead, she was causing scandal. Now let's talk about the documents that disappeared, because this is where the cover-up becomes systematic. Elizabeth's private papers, her personal letters, her diaries if she kept any, her medical records, all of it was supposed to be preserved. Royal papers were valuable historical documents. But when historians went looking decades later, huge chunks were missing, gone, burned supposedly in various fires over the years. How convenient. There's a particularly interesting gap in the records around 1561. Remember that year when Elizabeth was mysteriously bedridden with body swelling? The official government records from those months are unusually sparse. Diplomatic correspondence is missing. Court records are incomplete. It's like someone went through and carefully removed anything that might explain what actually happened. And maybe that's exactly what they did. In 1587, when a man named Arthur Dudley was arrested in Spain claiming to be Elizabeth and Robert Dudley's secret son, the Spanish took him seriously enough to interrogate him extensively. 3 letters survive describing these interrogations, letters that detail Arthur's claim that he was born in 1561, hidden at birth, raised by a family named Southern, and only discovered his true parentage as an adult. The English government's response? They declared him a fraud and a fantasist. They produced no evidence to disprove his claims, just insisted he was lying. And then all English records of this incident vanished. We only know about it because the Spanish kept copies. Was Arthur Dudley really Elizabeth's son? Almost certainly not. But the fact that the English government went to such lengths to erase all mention of him suggests they were nervous about something. Maybe not about Arthur specifically, but about the larger question his existence raised. Was Elizabeth physically capable of having children? And if not, why not? Here's another mysterious disappearance. In the 1570s, a French ambassador wrote detailed reports about his negotiations with Elizabeth regarding the Alençon marriage. He mentioned, cryptically, that there were physical impediments that made the marriage unlikely to succeed. These reports were kept in the French archives, but in the 1600s someone requested access to these specific documents, and shortly after they went missing, just those documents. The rest of the ambassador's reports survived, but the ones detailing Elizabeth's physical condition, gone, stolen, destroyed, hidden, we don't know, but gone. And then there's the suppression of medical theories. Remember Dr. Robert Berman's 1985 paper proposing that Elizabeth might have had case? The academic response wasn't just skeptical, it was hostile. He was accused of being sensationalist, of disrespecting Elizabeth's memory, of engaging in tabloid history. The paper was published in Medical Hypotheses, a journal that specialized in controversial theories, but mainstream historians largely refused to engage with it. Why? Because even 400 years later, we're still protecting Elizabeth's image, still treating certain questions as too dangerous to ask. But in 2008, something changed. The National Archives in London announced they'd found a document that had been lost for centuries, the original coroner's report from Amy Robsart's death in 1560. This was huge. For 450 years, historians had been debating whether Amy was murdered, and suddenly we had the actual medical evidence. The report described her injuries in detail, 2 dints on her head, broken neck, and ruled it misfortune, an accident. The discovery made headlines worldwide. Finally, evidence about one of Tudor history's greatest mysteries. But here's what's interesting. The document had been misfiled. It wasn't hidden or destroyed, it was just lost, in the wrong folder, uncatalogued, forgotten, which made historians wonder, what else is misfiled? What else is sitting in archives, uncatalogued, waiting to be discovered? What other secrets about Elizabeth might still exist? buried in paperwork, waiting for someone to look in the right place? This question became even more urgent in 2011 when researchers discovered another cache of previously unknown documents related to Elizabeth's court. These weren't dramatic revelations, mostly household accounts and minor correspondence, but they filled in details we'd never known. And they made historians realize we don't actually know everything about Elizabeth. The official history has gaps, convenient gaps. So what are we left with? 400 years after Elizabeth's death, we have more questions than answers. We have suggestive evidence of medical conditions she might have had: CAIS, vaginal agenesis, endometriosis, hormonal disorders, but no definitive proof. We have reports of her physical appearance that suggest something unusual: the height, the masculine features, the apparent lack of menstruation, but nothing conclusive. We have her own desperate efforts to avoid medical examination, to control her image, to die standing up rather than vulnerable in bed. But we can't say for certain what she was hiding. And you know what? Maybe that's how it should be. Maybe Elizabeth earned the right to take her secrets to the grave. She spent 70 years being scrutinized, speculated about, having every aspect of her body and her choices dissected by ambassadors and counselors and historians. Maybe in death she deserves privacy. Maybe the mystery is the point. But here's why I think the truth matters. Not to satisfy morbid curiosity or to tear down a legend, but because Elizabeth's story, the real story, with all its pain and compromise and secrets, is more powerful than the myth. The myth tells us she was perfect, that she chose loneliness freely, that her virginity was noble sacrifice. And that's inspiring, sure, but it's also inhuman. It makes Elizabeth into an icon instead of a person. The truth, or what we can piece together of it, tells us something different. It tells us about a woman dealt an impossible hand. Maybe she had a physical condition that made marriage impossible. Maybe she was traumatized by childhood abuse and couldn't bear intimacy. Maybe she was just playing political chess at the highest level. Probably all three. And instead of breaking under that pressure, instead of giving up or being crushed, she found a way to survive. She turned weakness into strength. She weaponized her virginity. She created a performance so compelling that we're still talking about it 400 years later. That's not less inspiring than the myth. It's more inspiring, because the myth is about someone who was born special and stayed special, but the truth is about someone who was damaged, compromised, scared and human, and who became great anyway. Not despite her struggles, but because of how she handled them. And maybe that's the real secret Elizabeth took to her grave. Not the medical details of her body, but the emotional truth of her choices. Did she really love England more than Robert Dudley? Or did she love Robert but love survival more? Did she really sacrifice marriage for her country? Or did she make a virtue of necessity? Did she die at peace, satisfied with her choices? Or did she die full of regret, wondering what might have been? We'll never know. The people who knew her, really knew her, who saw behind the performance, they're all dead. The documents are destroyed, the secrets are buried. And Elizabeth, wherever she is now, isn't talking. But sometimes I imagine her at the end, in those final hours at Richmond Palace, standing in the darkness, thinking about everything. The throne she'd won, the love she'd lost, the secret she'd kept, the performance she'd maintained for 44 years. And I imagine her feeling both things simultaneously. Pride and grief, triumph and loss, victory and loneliness, because that's what makes Elizabeth so endlessly fascinating. She's not a simple story. She's not a cautionary tale or an inspiration or a tragedy. She's all of those things at once. She's proof that you can be brilliant and broken, powerful and vulnerable, a legend and a human being, all at the same time. And as we sit here, 400 years later, still trying to understand her, still arguing about whether she was a medical curiosity or a political genius or a traumatized survivor or all three. Maybe that's her final victory. She wanted to control her story. She wanted to remain mysterious. She wanted us to remember Gloriana, not Elizabeth, and in that at least she succeeded. The woman died, but the mystery lives on. So here we are, at the end of Elizabeth's story, and if you're still with me, if you've journeyed through all 70 years of her life, through the trauma and the triumph, the secrets and the scandals, thank you. Thank you for caring about this complicated, contradictory, fascinating woman who's been dead for over 4 centuries but whose story still has the power to move us. Let me tell you what happened after Elizabeth died, because her story doesn't really end at Richmond Palace in 1603. It continues in how we remember her, how we interpret her, how her choices echo through history. James VI of Scotland became James I of England, uniting the crowns peacefully for the first time. No civil war, no bloodshed. The succession Elizabeth had worried about her entire life happened smoothly, which is ironic because she'd spent 44 years refusing to name an heir, terrified that naming someone would make her vulnerable, and in the end, everyone just knew. James was the obvious choice. All that stress, all that political manoeuvring, all those marriage negotiations, and the succession resolved itself naturally. But James had a problem. He was king because of Elizabeth, but he was also the son of Mary Queen of Scots, the woman Elizabeth had executed. How do you honour your predecessor when your predecessor killed your mother? James's solution was brilliant. He built monuments to both of them. Elizabeth got her elaborate tomb in Westminster Abbey, but so did Mary. He honoured them equally, these two queens who'd been enemies in life, and maybe that was the kindest thing he could do. Acknowledge that they were both complicated, both flawed, both human. The Elizabethan era became legendary almost immediately. Within decades, people were looking back at her reign as England's golden age. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, the flourishing of literature, Shakespeare, Marlowe, Spencer, the expansion of trade, the religious settlement that avoided the worst excesses of both Catholic and Protestant extremism. Elizabeth got credit for all of it. She became Gloriana in memory as she'd been in life. But here's what's interesting. Every generation remakes Elizabeth in its own image. In the 1700s, during the Enlightenment, she was celebrated as the rational queen who valued education and culture. In the Victorian era, when Britain was building its empire, Elizabeth became the proto-imperialist, the queen who'd started England's global dominance. In the early 1900s, she was the strong woman who proved women could lead. In the feminist movement of the 1960s and 70s, she became an icon of female independence, the woman who refused to be defined by marriage. And now, in our era of intense scrutiny about power, trauma and identity, we're asking different questions. We're looking at her relationship with Thomas Seymour and calling it what it was, abuse. We're examining her possible medical conditions with compassion instead of judgment. We're questioning whether her virginity was really a choice, or whether it was a brilliantly executed cover-up. We're seeing her not as perfect but as damaged, not as superhuman but as someone who survived impossible circumstances. And I think that's progress. Not because the old interpretations were wrong, but because the fuller picture, the messy, complicated human picture, gives us more to learn from. So what can we learn from Elizabeth I? What does her story tell us, here in the 21st century, about power and trauma and survival and the cost of greatness? First, I think she teaches us that survival is its own kind of triumph. Elizabeth shouldn't have made it. Statistically, historically, by all reasonable expectations, she should have been executed before she turned 30. Her mother was beheaded. Her stepmother Catherine Howard was beheaded. Lady Jane Grey was beheaded. These weren't abstract threats. These were women Elizabeth knew, women in similar positions, women who made one wrong move and lost their heads. Elizabeth watched this happen over and over, and yet she survived. She learned to read power, to navigate danger, to say the right thing at the right time. That's genius. That's worth celebrating. Second, she teaches us about the cost of that survival. Because yes, Elizabeth became the most powerful woman in Europe, but she paid for it with her personal happiness. No marriage, no children, no real intimacy, no one she could truly trust. Every relationship was transactional. Every emotion was performed. Every moment of vulnerability was a risk. She lived in a gilded cage of her own construction, and by the end she couldn't remember what it felt like to be free. Was it worth it? I can't answer that. You can't answer that. Only Elizabeth could answer that, and she never did. At least not clearly. She gave speeches about being married to England, about loving her people more than herself. But were those her true feelings, or just more performance? We'll never know. Third, and this is important, Elizabeth teaches us that women's bodies have always been battlegrounds. In the 1500s, a queen's primary value was her ability to produce male heirs. Her body wasn't her own, it belonged to the state. Elizabeth was pressured, harassed, legislated at, and judged based on her reproductive capacity from the moment she became queen until she was too old for it to matter. And the crazy thing is, that hasn't changed as much as we'd like to think. Women today still face intense scrutiny about their bodies, their choices about marriage and children, their appearance, their sexuality. Elizabeth responded to this scrutiny by taking control of the narrative. She couldn't stop people from talking about her body, but she could control the story they told. She turned the virgin thing into a brand. She made her unmarried state seem like strength instead of failure. She weaponized the very things people tried to use against her. And in 2025, in an era of intense social media scrutiny, that feels remarkably relevant. Elizabeth understood something we're all learning. You can't stop people from judging you, but you can control your own story. Fourth, she teaches us that trauma doesn't have to define you, but it does shape you. Elizabeth's childhood was nightmare fuel. 2 stepmothers beheaded, nearly executed herself as a teenager, sexually abused by Thomas Seymour, imprisoned in the Tower, watched her sister Mary kill people for their religion, all before she turned 25. That kind of trauma doesn't just go away. It rewires your brain. It changes how you see the world, how you trust people, how you connect. Elizabeth never got therapy. Therapy didn't exist. She never processed her trauma in any healthy way. Instead, she built walls. Emotional walls, physical walls, walls made of white paint and elaborate costumes and political maneuvering. Those walls kept her safe, but they also kept her isolated. And I think there's a lesson there about the difference between surviving trauma and healing from it. Elizabeth survived. Brilliantly. But did she heal? I don't think so. And her loneliness at the end was the price of that survival strategy. Fifth, and this might be the most important thing, Elizabeth teaches us that nobody is just one thing. She's not the heroic virgin queen or the tragic lonely woman or the political genius or the medical curiosity. She's all of those things. She's contradictory. She's complex. She contains multitudes. And that's okay. That's human. We want our historical figures to be simple. We want clear heroes and villains, clear lessons, clear morals. But Elizabeth refuses to be simple. She was brilliant and vain, strong and insecure, generous and cruel, independent and desperate for approval. She made extraordinary choices and paid extraordinary prices. She was magnificent and she was miserable. Both things are true. And maybe, just maybe, That's the most powerful lesson of all, that you can be complicated, that you can be damaged and brilliant simultaneously, that surviving terrible things doesn't make you perfect, but it does make you strong, that you can make choices you're proud of and still wonder what might have been, that you can be powerful and lonely, successful and sad, legendary and human. As I think about Elizabeth standing in that chamber at Richmond Palace in March 1603, refusing to lie down, refusing to surrender, I don't see it as stubbornness anymore. I see it as a woman who'd spent 70 years fighting for control of her body, her image, her story, and couldn't stop fighting even when the fight was over. I see exhaustion, I see fear, but I also see dignity. She was going to die on her own terms, in her own time, in her own way, and she did. When she finally lay down on March 21st, when she finally let go, maybe it felt like relief. Maybe after 70 years of standing guard over herself, over her secrets, over her kingdom, she could finally rest. Maybe in those last 3 days in bed, drifting between consciousness and dreams, she found some kind of peace. I hope she did. I hope in those final moments she wasn't Gloriana or the Virgin Queen or Elizabeth I. I hope she was just Elizabeth. Just a woman. Just a person who'd lived and loved and suffered and survived. And I hope that was enough. Her death was recorded as peaceful, mildly like a lamb, easily like a ripe apple from a tree. And you know what? I choose to believe that. Not because I know it's true, but because after everything Elizabeth went through, after 70 years of fear and performance and loneliness, she deserved a peaceful death. She deserved to slip away quietly, holding the letter from the man she loved, knowing that she'd done what she set out to do. She'd survived, she'd ruled, she'd won. And now, more than 400 years later, we remember her. Not perfectly, not simply, but we remember. Her face, or at least the white-painted version of it, is one of the most recognizable in history. Her story is still being told, reinterpreted, debated. She's been portrayed in hundreds of films, TV shows, books, plays. Every generation finds something new in her story, something that speaks to their particular moment. For us, in 2025, Elizabeth speaks to questions about power and vulnerability, about public image and private pain, about the masks we wear and the costs of wearing them. She speaks to anyone who's ever felt like they had to hide their true self to survive. Anyone who's ever chosen safety over intimacy. Anyone who's ever wondered if the person they've become is worth the person they gave up. And maybe that's why her story makes such a good bedtime story. Not because it's comfortable or simple, but because it reminds us that being human is complicated, that we all contain contradictions, that we're all performing in our own ways, trying to present our best selves while hiding the parts we think are broken. Elizabeth just did it on a grander scale, with higher stakes, for a longer time. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, I want you to think about something. Elizabeth spent her life creating an image, building a legend, performing perfection, and it worked. She became one of the most famous women in history. But the real Elizabeth, the scared girl who survived childhood trauma, the woman who loved Robert Dudley but couldn't have him, the person who stood for 15 hours because she was too afraid to lie down, that Elizabeth was hidden, buried under white paint and royal robes and 4 centuries of mythology. And I think there's something both sad and beautiful about that. Sad because she never got to be fully seen, fully known, fully herself. But beautiful because even hidden, even buried, even filtered through performance and propaganda and centuries of reinterpretation, she still reaches us. We still feel her. We still recognize something in her story that speaks to our own struggles with image and identity, power and vulnerability, survival and loneliness. So tonight, As you close your eyes, let yourself let go of performance. You don't have to be Gloriana. You don't have to stand when you're exhausted. You don't have to keep secrets or maintain an image or protect yourself from vulnerability. You can just be you. Complicated, contradictory, imperfect you. And that's enough. That's more than enough. Elizabeth couldn't do that, but you can. You can rest. You can sleep. You can surrender to the darkness without fear that it will destroy you. You can be vulnerable and survive. You can be human. And somewhere, maybe in Westminster Abbey or maybe in whatever comes after, maybe Elizabeth has finally found that peace too. Maybe she's finally put down the performance. Finally removed the white paint and the wig and the costume. Finally allowed herself to just be. No more standing, no more fighting, no more fear. Just rest. Just peace. Just an end to the loneliness that haunted her whole life. Sleep well, Elizabeth, you earned it. And sleep well, friends. Let Elizabeth's story be a reminder that we're all doing our best with impossible circumstances. That survival is triumph. That being complicated is being human. And that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stop fighting and just let go. Good night.